Good morning and welcome to the 14th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have received apologies from Mike O'Mara, who will not be attending the committee this morning. Ross will participate, but he will not arrive before around 10:15, so unfortunately he may not participate in this session. The first item on our agenda is an evidence session on the Scottish Budget in practice, and we are joined this morning by Stephen Boyle, Auditor General for Scotland, and Fiona Diggle, Audit Manager, Audit Scotland. I'd like to welcome you both to the meeting and invite the Auditor General to make a brief opening statement. Good morning.
Good morning. Many thanks, Convener, and thanks to you and the committee for your invitation. I very much welcome the opportunity to speak with you as part of your inquiry into the Scottish budget process in practice. Convener, in my response to your call for views, I highlighted a number of reports that both myself and my predecessor have published on the Scottish budget process, together with wider fiscal issues since the new budget process was introduced in 2017. Many of these reports highlight that the Scottish Government needs to improve its medium-term financial planning to ensure financial and fiscal sustainability in an ever uncertain world. Of course, Convener, since I submitted my response, we've seen some real live world examples of additional fiscal uncertainty. The international economic context has changed fundamentally as a result of the announcement of wide-ranging import tariffs from the US government and the impact that has had on both financial markets, and we'll see what that means for import and export arrangements across the UK and elsewhere. We think probably, Convener, it's too early to make kind of definitive judgments, but it adds another layer of uncertainty into the fiscal arrangements that both the UK and Scottish Government will have to manage. Looking forward to the publication of the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy and fiscal sustainability delivery plan next month, the current context highlights the importance of planning for a wide range of scenarios and understanding the risks on public funding and spending. In my response, I set a number of issues the Scottish Government should consider as part of its response through these outputs. Convener, both Fiona and I very much look forward to answering yours and the committee's questions this morning. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And the first thing I want to talk about is a slight, well, quite a significant, I think, difference of opinion between yourself and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. So in your submission, you've said that, and I quote, the Scottish Government should publish its financial and infrastructure medium-term strategies at the earliest opportunity. However, David Phillips, in his evidence from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, has said that, and I quote, the Scottish Parliament has welcomed and indeed pushed for this timing as the earliest practical opportunity to publish an MTFS in May 2025. In my view, this publication date is a mistake. I would have preferred to see the MTFS published after the summer recess and after the UK Government's multi-year spending review set to be published less than 2 weeks after the MTFS on June 11th. So, why do you think it should be published at the earliest opportunity when the IFS, who unfortunately are not giving evidence this morning, so we can't ask them directly, think that the opposite?
Yeah, so I think our position has been pretty clear for a while, Convener, that the ongoing absence of a medium-term financial strategy is a barrier to effective scrutiny, transparency of, as I've alluded to in opening remarks, some of the difficult decisions that will have to be made. We've said in a number of our reports that the strategy isn't just a one-item scenario. It requires multiple, detailed, fleshed-out scenarios across the various themes that the government is committed to delivering. And we've seen some examples of, through evidence that the Scottish Government, the former Permanent Secretary and his Directors General gave to the Public Audit Committee in March that set out kind of some of the areas that they're planning to include. So really our view is we're very keen to see what comes through next month. I think it's going to be really pivotal for the government's statement of how it intends to carry out medium-term financial planning to support parliamentary scrutiny of its spending plans. Addressing directly the point of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, I respect their position. I think what we're keen to see is this vacuum filled that we have now for nearly 2 years, not seen an updated medium-term financial strategy. I think what you've probably seen over that intervening period, there's always been something that has been said this is a reason not to publish. And I think that will ever be thus. I think what we need now is an updated statement strategy from which to work from, and clear understanding of when it will be taken forward and what adjustments made.
I mean, I don't doubt that the committee has a lot of sympathy for that, because we sat in the press for the MTFS, and we were really disappointed there wasn't one last year. I think the point that David Phillips is really trying to make is, we've waited this long. If we wait another few weeks, we might actually be able to get a more robust MTFS. It might actually be more impactful. I think that's the kind of position he's really taking. And I know he's saying that after summer, I mean, to me that seems a long time, but the difficulty is, of course, if it was to come out after the 11th of June, there would be difficulties in terms of finding time to scrutinise that before the autumn in any case, I suppose.
As I say, Convener, I respect the position that the IFS takes on this, but I think our view, and perhaps not entirely contradicted, is that there needs to be clarity about when these documents will be published and what circumstances are agreed that will lead to a deferral. Whether it's an economic crash, a Scottish Parliament election, a UK general election, and there's that clarity around the process for why a deferral will be taken. I mean, I'm sure the committee will want to explore further about the UK spending review, but I think in the round, I think my position remains unchanged, that we think it should be published as soon as possible.
Do you feel the government is too easily put off course by events, so to speak? Because obviously they talked about the general election. I mean, it seemed to me, understandable. That was the advice that was given by the Permanent Secretary. Of course, that they should not have the MTFS. I'm not convinced that many of my constituents would have been influenced in how they voted in terms of the MTFS, I have to be honest with you. But, there's a difference between delaying something because of a general election and then a year later we're still waiting on it. So do you think there should be, even if there's an element of flexibility in that for certain events, that flexibility should be less flexible than it currently appears to be?
I think there needs to be clarity, Convener, around what are the circumstances that will lead to a deferral of planned publications and how long that deferral should last for in the event of a delay. I go back to, I think, what I said in my submission in response to one of your earlier points. 2 years is too long a gap to wait for an updated medium-term financial strategy. And I accept absolutely the former Permanent Secretary's advice that as we saw last year, the upcoming UK general election wouldn't allow for the publication of medium-term financial strategy in 2024. But I think a stronger and more detailed clarity around how these arrangements will be applied is necessary, just to give that shared understanding. Okay,
thank you for that. I mean, you've talked about the sustainability delivery plan, which you say should be fully transparent about the scale of the risk, the affordability of public services and options for how the Scottish Government can manage them. I mean, what concerns do you have that it won't actually be?
So I think next month feels really important. With the publication of the medium-term financial strategy, fiscal sustainability delivery plan, I think in evidence to Public Audit Committee, government officials also stated that they would be publishing a public service reform strategy too. So there's lots to go through next month if that all is delivered as stated. Key, in our view, is that there is a clear alignment between these publications. And of course, I haven't mentioned the programme for government that will also be published on
next week.
Yep, absolutely, on the 6th of May. So, clarity.
You have no idea what's in that, mind.
I have used the word a few times. A real clarity of how the government intends to deliver upon its objectives. I mean, even just to refer the committee to the evidence to the Public Audit Committee, I think the Director General of the Scottish Exchequer advised that fiscal sustainability delivery plan will make reference to the sustainability and reform of health and social care in Scotland, the nature of the investment in social security, public service reform arrangements and government's plans for prevention, together with clarity on assumptions for public sector workforce and pay. These are all the right areas. Of course they are. These are the areas that matter. So I have no view to prejudge what might come through, Convener, on the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan. But I think alignment is the word I keep coming back to, that there's that clear thread between these various documents.
I mean, Fraser Valander and others have raised concern about the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan not being incorporated directly into the medium-term financial strategy. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I read the evidence that the committee has taken on that. I think some querying the need for an additional fiscal sustainability delivery plan alongside the medium-term financial strategy.
With a few more integrated documents, it seems to me the better, I would have thought. But
I'm probably not going to prejudge it until I see if there's a. I think I assume government officials really thought this through as to why it was necessary to have a fiscal sustainability delivery plan in addition to a medium-term financial strategy. I think my position, Convener, is I look forward to reading them when they are published next month. And I think the hook that I retain is what I've just set out from the evidence from the Director General about what will be set out in the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan. That it's a new thing means that I'm kind of keen to see how these documents work in practice. But apologies for repeating myself, but I think it's really that sense of alignment that, as to why what must surely come through when they are published.
I mean, you touched there on the programme for government. Do you think that the budget and the programme for government align strongly enough?
I think, for me, we've seen some evolution of the budget over the course of the past few years, notably last year's budget. I think for me the alignment to really evidence impact and delivery is the bit maybe we haven't touched on yet this morning, is the evolution of the National Performance Framework that the Deputy First Minister is committed to updating. I don't think we've seen a timescale for when that comes through. So, yes, alignment between the programme for government together with the budget, but also I think that tracking through an evidence basis of what's actually been achieved from government's plans, intentions, budget setting, and then the performance reporting thereafter. I think there's still work to do in these areas, Convener. Yeah,
I mean, I think the outcomes are really quite a concern about how they tie in, actually, with what the government professes to wish to deliver. I mean, in terms of the MTFS, go back to that, because that's obviously quite a significant part of your submission. I mean, you have talked about how there have been improvements, actually, over the medium term. In terms of, for example, quantifying the projected fiscal gap. But over the medium term, sorry. But I'm just wondering what other significant improvements you would like to see in the medium term financial strategy.
You're right. I think that's fair, Convener. We've seen, I think, last year's the 2023 medium term financial strategy begin to look at, as I mentioned, some of the drivers around spending. And Fiona might want to say a wee bit more about this. Some pay and workforce impact as an example of some of the positive developments of this. I'll pass to Fiona in a second. I think we're keen to see that improvement built upon in the next iteration with much more detailed scenarios. And going back to kind of some of your opening question this morning, there's perhaps never a great time to produce a medium-term financial strategy, but whatever is produced allows for events. There is flexibility, and then that clarity of intent for how the government plans to deliver upon its objectives. But I'll bring Fiona in to say a wee bit more.
Thank you and good morning. Yeah, that's right. I think in our report in November, the Auditor General highlighted that the MTFS in 2023 included the 3-pillar strategy towards fiscal sustainability. We found that useful, and it was a good broad direction of travel, but it didn't include the specific details about each area of activity and how that would contribute to fiscal sustainability. Across a number of outputs in recent years, the Auditor General has highlighted a couple of recommendations around what would improve the MTFS. So about specific detail about how a projected spending gap might be closed. In the report on workforce in 2023, specific elements on workforce in terms of workforce costs and numbers and workforce plans and the projected changes in spending as a result of workforce. And also about links between the MTFS and the medium-term financial framework for the health service as well.
And how closely do you feel that the government has actually stuck to the 2023 MTFS?
I think we have seen real challenges for the government in the intervening period. Convener, with, as Fiona mentions, a report from tail end of last year. I think what our overall judgment had been that the government, absolutely continued to deliver a balanced budget. So we've heard routinely that. I lose count, 19, 20 years in succession, the Scottish Government has had an unqualified opinion on its financial statements. But in doing so, it has, especially in recent years, with the result of some of the economic circumstances it's been responding to, has had to continue relying on short-term decisions to deliver fiscal balance.
Yeah, that's very clear within your document. You've raised concerns about that, yeah.
We've seen that. So I think that has been the theme of short-term focus and not then moving into some of the longer-term decisions. And I think we touched about some of this in January, did we not?
Is this because of the government's approach, for example, to public sector pay? So, for example, the UK government this morning made it absolutely crystal clear that it will not increase its offer to public sector workers of 2.8%. That's it. And we've obviously seen the government taking a very strong line in terms of the Birmingham strike, which has obviously been in the headlines for a number of weeks, whereas the Scottish Government set out 3% a year for 3 years. And yet, because of what's happened in previous years, it seems as if, the trade unions are looking at almost as a floor from which to negotiate from. And if that does prove to be the case and we end up with rises above that, and of course Scotland already, public sector workers are paid about £2,300 a year on average, more than the equivalents down south, then do you think there's a possibility that that could end up with yet another emergency statement in the autumn?
So perhaps not looking into the specifics of whether there will be an emergency. I think indeed the Permanent Secretary was pretty clear again in his evidence that wouldn't be his assumption before he finished his term in that role. Looking at the central role that workforce numbers and pay have to fiscal sustainability is really clear. And we have made a number of recommendations to that effect about the need for clarity around spending on staff and what are the government's plans for public service reform of workforce. The Minister has mentioned about the reform of public body landscape. So there's a lot to come through for me, Convener, over the next few weeks about what medium-term financial strategy will cover in terms of workforce, what the government's plans are to reform public services in Scotland, to deliver its prevention agenda, but how it will deliver that in a planned, affordable way that aligns with its priorities. I think, again, referencing back to a report from the end of last year, we'd seen clear steps to deliver financial balance through some of the emergency spending controls, but much less clarity about whether that actually fully aligned with the government's pillars and intent into the longer term. So, it certainly feels like a very important moment in terms of the government's fiscal plans that the month May 2025 will encapsulate in terms of new strategies, plans for public service reform, and how those will be taken forward is something we will track through our work.
Okay. In terms of the wider budget process and our call for evidence, in question 4 we asked how is the MTFS currently used by parliamentary committees, and it appears to me from your answer, which is quite detailed, that you've completely body swerved that part of the question.
So well, forgive me first of all, Convener, on that. In that case, typically when we respond to call for views, we sometimes deploy some licence really to address parts of the questions with which we think we can make an effective contribution. Typically, our silence...
That's a politician's answer.
Our silence betrays the fact that we maybe have nothing additional to support our evidence or useful to the committee's response. Having said all that, I think perhaps it's a fairly topical example I've mentioned a few times already. We are seeing very clearly the Public Audit Committee taking a strong interest in fiscal sustainability through some of our reporting, and indeed what I would say was a very full evidence session that committee took from the former Permanent Secretary and his senior officials in March in response to our report.
Yeah, because one of the issues for this committee obviously is that we do want to see committees have a greater role, etc., in terms of their budgets. I think there's a kind of, certainly from my perspective, I feel that sometimes budgets just feel, that's the job of the Finance Committee, and as a result, I don't think MSPs in the main have is sound a knowledge of the Parliament's budget and its intricacies as perhaps they should have. So that's really why we were asking that kind of question.
I mean, Fiona might want to say a bit more about it. I think there is increased appetite, that it needs to be additional appetite, as part of especially pre-budget scrutiny arrangements across the committees of this Parliament. And the medium-term financial strategy, done properly, can be an incredibly helpful, powerful tool for committees to support their programme of work, their scrutiny of government. So there's undoubtedly a space that could be developed, and Convener, we can think carefully about how we might, through our own reporting, support that interest. But I'll pass to Fiona if you want to add.
I think just an observation that over the last 4 or 5 years or so during the session, there's been a lot of variation in the MTFSs as well. So I think in terms of the basis that a sector committee might review is varied a lot. I think as we set out, the MTFS 2023 was a step forward, but then with a gap, it makes it harder for scrutiny as well.
Because I think it's interesting that, that committees may be somewhat loath to look at the MTFS and how it affects their committees, but that's maybe something we should certainly look to in the future. I know I personally feel that when new MSPs come in next year, there should be an element of induction on some of these areas to let people know what it is we're actually talking about. There's not much point if there's only 10 or 20% of the Parliament are actually effectively debating some of these issues. Now, in terms of how effective is current public engagement, you've talked about the Scottish Government has made some progress in making the budget more transparent over the last 4 years, but it's still failing to reach standards considered adequate by international best practice. And you go on to say greater budget transparency is needed to realise human rights. So what would you say, what country or countries would you say are the gold standard in terms of this?
Yeah, I think Fiona might want to say actually, but I think you're referring really the work that we draw in some of the judgments of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which I suppose compared the openness of budgetary process with over 100 countries. If we've got the detail of those or who represents best practice, we can share that with you. But just a bit of detail, Convener. The Scottish Government has made some progress with its transparency, but not yet reaching adequate standards. And then
adequate's quite a... It's the difference between best practice and adequate. I mean, adequate is like, you're struggling. Best practice is, is a different thing altogether. You're trying to be the best. I mean, obviously. So are you saying that we're below average in Scotland in terms of these areas? For absolute clarity,
that part of submission draws on the judgments that the Scottish Human Rights Commission...
Yeah, I see that.
So making their judgments, they might be better placed to make reference to the distinction between best practice and adequacy. I'll pass to Fiona, but I think again I think it's interesting just about some of the my sense again of some of the recent evidence that Scottish officials have given to parliamentary committees is a recognition that there is some additional work to do in this area. Particularly, they drew attention to their some of their equalities assessments that they might be factoring into future budget submissions. But I'll pass to Fiona to say a bit more.
In terms of the detail of the OBS report, I think we haven't got that to hand, but we could share that with you. I think it's worth flagging that there's lots of interesting models being talked about. I know that you talked about the Finnish model with Professor Bell and Professor Spowage last week. There's also some discussion about the Dutch model for reviewing value for money in between spending reviews. I think, which was in the National Audit Office report on spending reviews, and there was some interesting examples from the OECD report on the SFC as well. So there's lots of interesting examples out there. I think in terms of the points the SHRC bring out in their report, they're all quite sensible things.
Well, some of them I'm going to challenge in a minute, but I have to be honest with you. But I mean, but you seem to be talking about bits and bobs for different countries. There's no real gold standard there. You can't just say, well, that country does everything. We should look to try and not emulate 100%. Obviously, we can't. I mean, it's a devolved parliament, and these countries are independent countries of different status apart from anything else. I suppose we could look at land or states, or whatever. But I'm just wondering if there is a goal. If talking about international best practice, it's important to tell us where that international best practice is, so we can perhaps look at it.
Yeah, I think all models are different and all countries are different, but there's lots of rich ideas that can be drawn upon. But we can provide more information on the OBS report.
Yeah, and in terms of challenging some of these things, it says its recommendations are make budget publications in an accessible, simplified format and in different languages with the participation of existing civil society groups. Now, I realise that's what they're saying, but how would that work? In what languages? So I mean, who's going to want to read the Scottish budget in Hungarian, for example, or Urdu or Swahili or Spanish? I mean, surely this is just nonsense, really, is it not? I mean, let's be honest. If you're in, everybody here in the country, bar a small minority, is pretty fluent in English, and I think those who are not will have other priorities in reading the Scottish budget documents.
So, I don't know, Convener, actually. I don't know if that's the case. I think there's, if it's genuine participatory budgeting and engagement, and English isn't your first language, then I'm drawing on the work of SHRC that they'll say, well, actually, why would you not want to, if it means taking relatively small steps to make...
But is it relatively small steps? I mean, if you're only going to have half a dozen people reading it, and it costs a huge amount of money, probably thousands of pounds to translate a document into one language, never mind. I don't know how many languages are being proposed here. Do we know?
So I don't. I think that's perhaps a...
languages, I mean, it's just an empty statement, is it not? I mean, it means nothing unless you actually say what the languages are and how many there are and what the cost implications would be. And, that's the thing. I mean, I find it frustrating when I read things like that, to be honest. It's almost like a throwaway line rather than actually a serious policy intent, is it not?
So I can see the frustration on it, but I think the intent is reasonable in my view, that this is about making what can feel, I think even your own comment earlier on about if people's view is that within the Parliament, some of your fellow members' view that budgeting and budget scrutiny is just a matter for the Finance Committee. If you extrapolate that outside of the Parliament and you want people to be engaged in spending decisions, that the National Performance Framework, by extension, is about how Scotland performs. And the Scottish Government's ambition is that people are engaged in this process, then some steps might need to be taken. And forgive me, I don't have insight into what translation costs would be, or what usage there would be of a translated Scottish budget document. The SHRC might be able to offer the committee more insight on that basis. But I don't think making small, reasonable adjustments should be a barrier to making more accessible.
I agree. I just don't think it's particularly small, reasonable or particularly appropriate. You've also said one other thing on this. You also said they should publish a citizen's version of each key document. What does that mean?
I think just a document that's more accessible, that's more understandable.
In what way? How can you make the budget document more accessible? Because it's more accessible,
we get this challenge a lot, convener, actually, when it comes to accounts, annual accounts, for example. Because
I think if you look, for example, at the Scottish Fiscal Commission, their stuff's written in very straightforward, plain English, with lots of explanations at the end of what all the acronyms are, etc. So how would you improve on that, for example, if that's something you feel should be improved upon?
This is something we've been working on at Scotland, actually. So we now produce easy read versions of our reports, which are very simple, limited text and with some diagrams and explanations, just to make them as accessible to as many people as possible.
There are standards, communication standards around this. And Fiona mentions that we've trying to adopt both in our publications and our website.
And do you feel the government aren't meeting that standard?
So I think it's a question for government, just for them to confirm that, with the degree of inevitability, a medium-term financial strategy, and I say none of us have seen a fiscal sustainability delivery plan yet, with the first one being next month, is that there will be an assumption, I'm sure, that these will be very technical documents that will be produced for only a small number of people. But if you are to encapsulate the ambitions of an engaged populace in Parliament's activities, then making small, reasonable changes feel like an appropriate thing to do.
I think everybody wants the population to be more engaged. We would like on occasion, to a public gathering in this committee to be more than just the people who are going to be giving evidence in the next session, or a couple of students who've wandered in and 5 minutes later decide, let's just wander back out again. So, I think we would all like more engagement. I just think it's about being realistic and practical and pragmatic, and I think the first group of people who need to be au fait with all these documents are probably elected representatives, A, in this Parliament, and B, in the UK Parliament, and C, in local authorities, and obviously the people who have to deal with these issues on a third sector, etc. But I think sometimes it can be quite unrealistic to talk about public buy-in, because people have got other priorities in life, frankly, than looking through a 140-page draft budget document or a 90-page sustainability document. Life really is too short for most people.
So I recognise all of that, convener. I think where we've got to, and just sympathy with SHRC's position, that public bodies, and there will be clear responsibilities for public bodies to make documents accessible in easy read formats, website compliance and so forth, and translation as necessary, that these shouldn't be barriers to making it more open and removing what some of the actual or perceived blockages or barriers to engagement.
Okay, let's open up the session to colleagues around the table, and it'll be John to be followed by Craig.
Thanks very much, convener. Yes, to maybe go over some of the ground that the convener's been on already. The assumption is that it is a good thing to have a medium-term financial strategy and plans for the future. Scottish Fiscal Commission, OBR, are looking 50 years ahead. But given, what we've already said, which is we have to balance the budget every year, things come up that we're not expecting, like the UK gives a higher pay increase to public sector workers, so we have to kind of follow that. Is there really any value? Are you convinced there's a value in having a 5-year plan or anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. I am, and I accept all that you say, Mr. Mason, that there will be events. There may be fiscal challenges, economic shocks, unanticipated elections, budget challenges, you name it. I even alluded to in my opening remarks about some of the impact that tariffs might cause. For me, I think this, rather than saying that is a reason why not to do medium-term financial strategy, for me it reinforces why it's all the more necessary. And not just a financial strategy that gives broad brush recognition of scenarios, but ones that will be useful in practice. That if you look at, talk about, for example, I think maybe even we talked about this when I was last with the committee. Public sector in Scotland will be employing people for decades. We have public sector pension commitments that will last for decades. The assets that we use, notwithstanding some of the public service reform, will still need to be owned, managed and maintained into the future. And setting that out clearly, I think, provides transparency and supports effective decision-making and scrutiny. So I recognise the reasons why not to do it, but I don't think they are solid against the reasons why I think we should have medium-term financial planning.
And can you spell out then what difference either it might have made if we'd had better medium-term and more frequent medium-term financial strategies in the last few years? And you've mentioned particularly maybe capital projects and workforce planning, all that side of things. I mean, what would have made any difference? And going forward, can you expand on where it would make a difference? I mean, we want to build more houses, we want to build dual A9. There's a whole lot of capital projects out there, but we're not going to know what the capital budget is, so can we plan ahead?
So if you allow me to make a distinction between capital and revenue for a moment. So I think on capital, firstly, the Scottish Government's infrastructure investment plans for capital won't be set out until after the UK spending review is the intention. Not at the risk of contradicting myself to the convener's earlier line of questioning, I think that is clear and that's the stated plan is reasonable. And I'd say that on the basis that what we've seen in recent years is a contraction of the capital budget, as this committee will be familiar with. That to prioritise capital investment needs that level of uncertainty. But it's still it's not a reason not to do medium-term capital planning for all the reasons that we've touched on. In terms of the examples around revenue, our reports over many years have talked about the unsustainability of public spending in Scotland and the need for reform, change of how public services are delivered. We've seen some examples that have been alluded to already of how the Scottish Government has responded to those challenges with emergencies, budget arrangements, spending decisions. And some of the detail of how fiscal balance has been delivered each year as it has have been as a consequence of, I think, a lack of clarity around whether some of the decisions that were made were actually aligned with priorities or whether these were budgets that were underspent that could more easily be amended during the course of the year, rather than a real step-back plan that here's the response that the government would take in the event of fiscal challenges. So I think there's good evidence in recent years as to how the government has responded to shocks, but that it hasn't been aligned to that longer-term plan thinking around reform and sustainability.
But I suppose my question still is that actually possible? I mean, or does it just need more political will or whatever? I mean, if we take pay, I mean, I think the idea was the plan was 3% if it was 1 year, 9% if it was 3 years. And yet, within a month or two, I believe the NHS has been offered 4.25% for this year. So, again, I just say, if that kind of thing is going to happen, or are you saying that somehow the government should be more tied into the longer plan, and so when it comes to a short-term, for example, a pay increase demand, they just say no to that, and if we get strikes, then that's just that.
So these were government political decisions, of course, as to what pay award. I think what we would expect to see is, if the base assumption is going to change, having an alternative assumption, plan B, C and D, for how, if pay is going to consume a larger proportion, and of course, pay is typically baked in if it's not accompanied by reform arrangements, what's going to be deprioritised instead? And I don't think we have that level of detail to effectively scrutinise how those decisions align with the government's pillars for spending. I absolutely remain optimistic, Mr Mason, that based on what we've heard already, is that we'll begin to see more detail of that next month. But it's those type of decisions at the moment that feel are being made without the level of clarity into the longer term.
Because I think, as has been raised, and probably raise it in our next session as well, I mean, if you lay out a number of scenarios A, B, C, D, you know, the media and everybody, the way it is, will go for the absolute worst. So, I mean, if we say, well, if teachers get a bigger pay increase, we'll have to increase class sizes to compensate, you know, then immediately that would become the headline. And, you know, so, I mean, politically, is it realistic to lay out options, some of which would be pretty unpalatable?
I think what government have stated, and, you know, and I appreciate you have the Minister with you later on this morning, is that they plan to reform public services to align them with their pillars, to, you know, to support a preventative approach to public service delivery. We've also heard the government state that they intend to again, to use their phrase, not mine, to right-size the public service workforce. That detail hasn't yet been provided. Of course there will be a response, and we've seen that. Indeed, from the use of the Scottish Fiscal Commission's work. You know, so when they've set out some of the downside scenarios that talk about an up to £2 billion gap, as was. But what it did provide was clarity and understanding, ability to scrutinise and challenge. So I don't think, you know, a fear of how that might be interpreted should be a barrier. If anything, I think a virtue could be made of this is providing real transparency of the scale of decisions that still need to be made.
Okay. On a slightly different subject, I think you're a little bit sceptical about the committees doing year-round work if they don't have enough information from the government. I would just want to, if you could maybe expand on that, because I mean, I'm keen on the idea that the committees do work all through the year in relation to the budget. So, for example, the Education Committee has been looking at Dundee University, which has obviously become quite a challenge. So I see that as part of their budget work. I mean, that's not coming from the government, that's coming from circumstances, the situation around funding for universities, all of that kind of thing. So do you not think it's possible for the committees to be doing a lot of budget work, whether or not they get information from the government?
Yeah, absolutely. But just to be clear, I think it is an important feature of the work of committees across the Parliament to be considering, you know, progress against spending, looking towards not just next year, but, you know, years into the future, perhaps the duration of the parliamentary term, to have that embedded as part of their work programme. So apology, no disagreement from me on that.
Okay, fair enough. The point that's come up about, and the convener kind of touched on it, about the capacity of MSPs and committees, and we have had the problem that, you know, committees do seem to leave it to this committee to look after the budget and so on and so forth. Do you think we should be trying to change that scenario? And if so, have you any suggestions how we can get the committees to look at the finances more?
Yeah, so I think you should be looking to engage members from across the Parliament in matters of finance. If anything, I think I see a parallel with Public Audit Committee. I think there's some members who are not on the Public Audit Committee are terribly engaged in, you know, some of our work, our audit reports, but yet we think they are relevant. They're an extension of the work of how public money was spent and then deliver as intended. So through the work of this committee, the parliamentary corporate body, and indeed ourselves, we're very happy to play our part. Whether you'll achieve that in this parliamentary term, I think is maybe optimistic, but I think there's a very real opportunity for the next session, for this committee, for the Parliament itself, to be absolutely clear about its ambition for scrutiny, the work of how budgets, their role play across Parliament. From Audit Scotland's perspective, we're very keen to play a part, I suppose, of any induction arrangements that you might be offering to new members when that happens next year.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Boyle, and welcome to the committee. We were talking about trying to be transparent and putting complex data and reports into more simplified language. Now, you call for greater transparency in relation to budgetary information to improve the effectiveness of the budget process. So to a layman, what would that greater transparency look like? How would you bring that about?
Well, yeah, good morning, Mr. I'll start and I'll bring Fiona into a bit of detail. But if I go back to some of the discussion we've had this morning about, in particular reference to medium-term financial strategy, is firstly keen to see level of detail that supports scrutiny, more detailed scenarios, but especially to the opportunity that the government has created with its intended publications next month. As I mentioned in response to the convener, looking to see that alignment, so real transparency between the MTFS through to the fiscal sustainability delivery plan and then the public service reform strategy, all intended next month. So an alignment, clarity, and how they will address the big challenges. And so as we've heard from government officials that health and social care reform, the investment that the government intends to make in social security arrangements, public service reform more widely, and then real significant issues around pay and workforce. So these are so fundamental to the delivery of the Scottish budget, the sustainability of public services really for the rest of this decade. So that has to be done with real clarity. Just check with you if I missed anything.
And I think just maybe the link between what they hope spending will achieve in terms of outcomes and services as well.
Yeah. In your submission, I think elsewhere, you've said that the Scottish Government does not know where it can flex its budget easily to accommodate short-term fluctuations or longer-term commitments. And you say that a better understanding of the Government's cost base would help develop its spending review. Now, when I ran a private sector business, I had a detailed understanding of the cost base because every pound spent unnecessarily was a pound less in profit. Why wouldn't the Government have a detailed understanding of its cost base?
So that is the judgment that we reached, and I think we set out in our publication in November, that when events took place, the Scottish Government wasn't clear enough about where there is flexibility within its spending plans that they might go to address an economic shock, for example. So what we found was that instead there appeared to be more opportunistic approaches to reducing spending on certain areas of the approved budget than others. Instead, what you would expect to see is a real clarity around which programmes of spending are variable, and those would be set out publicly. These are the areas that we will step back from in terms of delivering a fiscal balance. I think we've seen a recognition of that in some of the evidence that the government gave to the Public Audit Committee. What we're looking next to see is and what next. So where are those variable areas of expenditure? There's that level of transparency that accompanies that.
So would an example of that be, let's say, for example, when the government was facing a budgetary shortfall, it took a scythe to housing, for example, and employability schemes in the recent budget. Yet, if you're going to eradicate poverty, presumably those two areas are vital. Is that the kind of example of the knee-jerk response you're talking about? So
the other example I think was high profile at the time was some expenditure on mental health services. Was also identified as an area that would be used to deliver fiscal balance. So what we're unclear on, were those the government's intended areas of reduced spending before the shock happened, or were just those budgets that were, through a variety of reasons, underspending, and it was available to be used to deliver fiscal balance? It's that upstream clarity that a recommendation was designed to address.
Pejoratively, I would say they're making up as they go along. But in terms of the medium-term fiscal strategy, you've called for greater focus on how the funding gap will be closed. If this doesn't happen, if the government doesn't focus on this, where do we end up in 2, 5 and 10 years' time?
So I think some of the examples we've seen in recent years, so emergency interventions, spending controls to deliver financial balance. And as the government quite rightly points out, it has delivered financial balance each year, sometimes in more challenging years and sometimes in not. I think there's an acceptance from government with the work around public service reform and the awaited public service reform strategy, that work is needed so that the government doesn't find itself in positions of having to make these types of interventions mid-year to deliver financial balance. I think the reality, Mr. Roy, is it's going to get harder. You know, without a clear programme of reform around workforce, the adoption of technology to deliver the preventative approach, together with real clarity around how Scotland's public services are going to use their estate, that across the piece we have generally an incremental based model of public services, and you know, and as some people have called for a zero-based budgeting approach to public services, we don't quite get into that area, but just how public services will be reformed on a planned basis to deliver fiscal balance from 1 year to the next and into the medium term.
Obviously, in a number of reports, you've been warning about the long-term sustainability of the Scottish public finances. Other bodies have as well in front of this committee and other committees. But yet, some of the underlying trends, largely public sector workforce and social security, recent experiences don't suggest that the government are taking this seriously. So, for example, since 2016, there's been a 71% rise in the civil service workforce. The number of senior civil servants at grade C1, C2 and C3 has tripled. Those are recent trends, and there's no real sign that they are turning the ship around here. The Scottish Government says, for example, they've made great success in reducing the size of the contingent workforce, but yet they seem to be leaving the back door and potentially coming in through the front door as full-time civil servants. So is the Government taking these warnings seriously, or are they just simply discounting them and saying that you're all wrong and actually this is a sustainable path that they're on?
Next month's publications are so important to provide that clarity of the medium-term direction of travel for not just Scotland's public finances, but I think also service delivery models. As the Permanent Secretary advised the Public Audit Committee, there will be a public service reform strategy next month. The success of these will be around the alignment. So there's that flow through from the top-level medium-term financial strategy to the detailed scenarios, how it connects to the fiscal sustainability delivery plan, and then the detail of plans to reform public services. I don't doubt this will be challenging and complicated, but I think it goes back to your previous question. If Scotland doesn't do this, it's going to become harder to deliver public services with the models that we have. And indeed, I think some of the figures that you mentioned, Mr. Hoy, we touched on in our own briefing report on Scotland's public service workforce from a couple of years ago, just the growth and the need for plan around how civil service will operate in the future.
Has any Mandarin or senior minister explained to you why Scotland now needs 3 times more senior civil servants now than it did in 2016?
So I've not had that direct conversation, but I think it speaks to some of the points that have been raised a couple of times already this morning, that Scotland's public sector workforce per capita is generally larger than the rest of the UK. They're typically paid more. And based on some of the decisions that the UK government might make and how that interacts with Barnett consequentials, that will result in Scotland having to make alternative decisions, whether that's around tax or spending to deliver fiscal balance. Looking for that clarity, I think, what we'll see through publications next month.
Super. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Michelle, to be followed by Liz.
Hi. As is the nature of these things, a lot of the questions I was going to ask have been covered, so I'll just pick up on a couple of points. Going back to the thing about the question about how effective is current political engagement, I know there's been quite a discussion about that already, but I suppose I'd like to gently challenge you why you chose to refer to the Scottish Human Rights Commission for their kind of contribution rather than giving your own view as the Auditor General. And does that mean that you don't have a view, or you just couldn't think of anything?
So I think, as I mentioned, we'll generally, if we don't think we have something to add to a call for views, we'll generally leave a particular section area blank. No, I think our assessment of the Scottish Human Rights Commission was that this was a rounded assessment and contribution, and there were reasonable parallels to some of our own judgments and reports that we'd made in recent times about the need for transparency, particularly around the Scottish budget, especially, and then linking that to the National Performance Framework. That we in, I think we're in the third or fourth iteration of the National Performance Framework, but still not quite had the impact or traction that was originally envisaged, that would set out how public services are being delivered. And part of that sphere is that people are engaged, in, not just electorally, but a real sense of how public spending has delivered for them. So, no, I think our assessment was that was a reasonable suite of views, and not one that we thought we would look to deviate from and present as our own.
Yeah. And so, I mean, again, a lot of this has been covered, but you see the National Performance Framework, I don't want to put words in your mouth, as the most accessible way that ordinary members of the public can grasp the kind of thematics and what it means for them.
I think if done properly, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I think there's a gap though.
I agree. And the reason I'm asking that is that one of the challenges, I mean, because I do try and explain to people, is the complexity of the fiscal framework. Because people ask a straight question, and I desperately try not to sound like a politician by saying it depends, then trying to explain simply why it depends, by which point inevitably I've lost them. So I'd like your comments on that, and also in terms of, I mean, I noticed that the Scottish Fiscal Commission are doing considerably more work now, which I think is very welcome, to point out the issues with UK fiscal sustainability, because if you understand anything about the fiscal framework, you understand how there's a critical dependency on UK fiscal sustainability. And I wanted to understand what thought you had given to that, because if you understand about the fiscal framework and you understand about fiscal sustainability, you cannot have one without the other. I appreciate you're the audit and it's different. I do get that. But I'd like some reflections on what consideration you're giving to this sort of wider economic environment.
Yeah, very, very happy to comment on that. And I wouldn't disagree with what you've set out, Ms Thompson, especially the fiscal framework. I think people ask me about it, I say it's complicated. And
that's a better explanation than mine, I suspect.
And I appreciate we're now in the second iteration of the fiscal framework between the two governments. And I accept by necessity that some of this will be technical and complicated. Now, you haven't asked this directly, but getting to a question of, can we make this understandable for people? I think that's a challenge that we have to rise to find a way of, perhaps bridging into your second question about, of course, you're quite right, there is clearly a connection between UK economic situation and the performance and the income expenditure of the Scottish Government. We are thinking really carefully about this. We'll be producing a report towards the end of this year on Scotland's tax and fiscal sustainability matters, building on some of the reporting that we did at the end of last year. I would maybe refer also the committee to a report I produce annually on the operation of Scottish income tax to support the scrutiny that the Public Audit Committee does of the National Audit Office audit of Scottish income tax, which again really is the tail end of how these matters operate. And we sought in the report that we produced in January to bring some insight to the application of fiscal framework, application of tax policy in Scotland, about, again, drawing on the work of colleagues in the Scottish Fiscal Commission about the economic performance gap and some of those factors too. So yes, we do approach this from an audit perspective, and I think, again, looking to the end of this year will be our next report on how that is operating.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that the Scottish Fiscal Commission have slightly rephrased that terminology, probably to recognise the critical dependency. Just returning to the question that Craig Hoy asked, a better understanding of its cost base. Do you think it's the case that actually they have an understanding of the cost base, but it goes back to the point that John Mason was making earlier. To reflect that understanding of the cost base is so politically unpalatable, it's probably better to keep stum. Are you just being kind and saying that they don't have an understanding of their cost base?
I think we're trying to be relatively clear that, for me, it goes back to the scenarios. So, if there's an intervention required, that's based on an alignment between government priorities, rather than which budgets are underspending for whatever circumstances. And I don't think we've seen enough evidence that that's the case yet. It seems the decisions to deliver financial balance in challenging periods were done on those budgets were underspending, rather than we intend to deprioritise clearly a particular area of policy implementation.
Okay, and my last question then, just to finish off, is we've covered off a lot of gamut of all the various sort of documents, and of course it's incredibly complex and very difficult to align all of these. So, and we've got the UK spending review, as you correctly commented. Based on your experience thus far, how confident are you that alignment with particularly the future projections against this very, these really challenging times can be brought into line with the clarity and purpose that we're all seeking?
So I think I'll reserve judgment.
Okay.
And I think we've seen some fluctuation in the, particularly the medium-term financial strategies in recent times about depth, content, quality. But I'll still comment, and I still believe it's absolutely essential if government intends to produce these suite of reports about how it will deliver public services and fiscal sustainability, that there needs to be a clear thread between them, or else you're left with the question of why bother producing one as a standalone if it doesn't interact with what spending intentions are, how you'll respond to challenging circumstances, and then ultimately the National Performance Framework, what did you actually deliver?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Liz?
Thank you. Last week we had some very interesting conversations with the OBR about some of the challenges that are facing forecasters, and I suspect we might have similar discussions with the Scottish Fiscal Commission in the second evidence session this morning. I raise this because there was obviously very considerable frustration expressed by the OBR about the recent spring statement that the projections they'd made when it came to welfare spending turned out not to be the case in terms of the policy commitments that the UK government had made. So very quick, short-term and very late adjustments were made, creating considerable frustration and difficulties for the OBR. And of course in Scotland, the Scottish Fiscal Commission expressed its concerns at the time of the mitigation of the two-child cap, that came very late in the day. Now, I know you can't comment on policy, whether it's the right policy or not. Do you think that these challenges of very late announcements are creating genuine difficulties for forecasters and therefore for people like yourself who are having to audit what's happening? Do you think that's causing greater difficulty?
So it's probably not the easiest area for me to get into, but recognising and respecting the evidence that you heard from OBR and indeed the Scottish Fiscal Commission's view on this. I think in the round it speaks to some of the judgments we've been making about transparency and the need for clarity around when publications will take place. Even in some of today's discussion already, that and when publications will be produced in the event that something else happens. So an economic shock or an election, what the delay period will be. So everybody knows what the rules of the game, as it were, and that forecasters have the information. Auditors like myself are clear when documents will be produced. All of that additional transparency will certainly help, Ms Smith.
In relation to what you said earlier about, obviously there have been issues where short-term planning has taken over from longer-term planning, and in difficult economic circumstances, which you cited earlier quite rightly, that tends to happen because you're having to make quick adjustments, particularly if on an international basis something happens with an exogenous shock. It happens in the UK sometimes. Do you feel that that is an issue, again, when we're looking at the transparency aspect of this, that having to make adjustments on the short-term basis very quickly is creating some challenge for medium-term and longer-term financial planning?
I think what we saw examples of was, as mentioned Mr Hoy, the Scottish Government had to intervene. It doesn't have any choice, as the committee knows, other than to deliver financial balance to the nature of how devolved finances and indeed UK government operate too. Scottish Government is, as the committee knows, through the fiscal framework, it has some mechanisms that it can deploy through the fiscal framework to borrow for economic shocks, but these are generally fairly limited. So in that context, I think it goes back to, I suppose, where we've been, and we've set out in our submission that having a clarity of a direction of travel for sustainability of public service reform, together with scenarios that can allow for events in the medium term, and then a really detailed scenario for in-year about how government would respond in the event of a particular shock. Where are the priorities? Which areas will be deprioritised? And I think it's that clarity that we're optimistic that we'll see next month.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Just another couple of questions from me. One is David Bell last week said that further improvements can be made, including clarity around regular in-year transfers in the Scottish budget. Now, when we look at the spring and autumn revisions, I mean, myself and colleagues have often raised issues that every year we get the same transfer of resources from one budget line to another, and we've speculated about what the reason for that is. But what's your view on that?
Yeah, Fiona might come in as well. I think it's one of a need for transparency, convener, of where there is a transfer from one budget line to another. That's set out why, but together with it, and able to track performance against what was the original budget. Before I did this role, convener, I've been an accountant earlier part of my career, and the budget in organisations I've been in remained the budget. And there was performance against the original budget was what was reported. In a parliamentary sense, that may or may not be appropriate. But what it did provide was real clarity. You could see what was spent against the original budget line. But I recognise absolutely that spring budget revisions and autumn budget revisions are part of the fabric of how public spending operates. And if a mechanism needs to be found that find a way of just tracking changes more clearly than we've got, I'm sympathetic to that.
Now, one of the points you actually raised in your evidence earlier was about technology, and you talked about reform and how technology can help reduce costs for the Scottish Government. But page 55 of the Scottish Fiscal Commission Sustainability Document on Health, they have said that they assume that healthcare costs will increase by 1% every year for the next half century. And they talk about the Baumol effect in terms of healthcare being labour intensive, etc., long-term conditions. But they also say that 0.13 percentage points of that increase in annual spend, so cumulatively over 50 years, that's clearly a lot, captures the effect of technological advancements on healthcare costs. Developments of medical devices, techniques and procedures tend to push up costs, where costs reduced can result in the expansion of treatments. So is it not the case that technology doesn't always deliver the savings that one might look for?
Yes, a very reasonable statement to make.
Well, they're right behind you, so I'm glad you're saying that.
And I think it's that level of clarity. So, of course, as you go much further out, we can only make assumptions. But there's a very pressing need for public service reform, and the government has stated as one of its parts of its public service reform is greater use of technology, whether that's artificial intelligence, machine learning, whatever. But it's the detail, convener, that to be accompanied by that. So not to make general statements that technology will provide a way, but to reduce the cost base or to change how public services are delivered, but looking to see what and when.
Are there any examples that the Scottish Government can copy? Maybe last year we visited Stone and looked at their incredible X-Road system, for example. Is there anything that you would recommend?
I think the last time I was with you, Convener, you had Registers of Scotland on the panel, and we've seen from that organisation together with Disclosure Scotland are two public sector organisations in Scotland, and there are many others who are adopting technology to fundamentally change very traditional models of public service delivery. The point that I think that you're making, though, is that adoption of technology has a number of factors in terms of quality of service delivery, ease of the public accessing the service, but at some point, real consideration needs to be given. And what does that mean for the model internally to deliver the service? Do we still need that building, for example? Is it still being used? Do we need as many people? Do we need a different skill set to deliver the service? It's that level of thinking and planning around that we're looking to see in terms of technology adoption.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any final points you wish to make to the committee if you haven't touched on or you would want to make before we wind up the session?
Not from me, Convener. Thank you very much for your invitation this morning.
Thank you very much for your evidence. I'll make sure I speak to Kate Forbes and demand that she produces a Gaelic translation next year if she's not too busy. Okay, well, thank you. I'll now call a 5-minute break and then we'll have the next session. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence from the Scottish Fiscal Commission on its latest Fiscal Sustainability Report, published on 8th of April 2025, and which has a particular focus on health. I'd like to welcome to the meeting Professor Graham Roy, Chair, Professor Francis Breeden, Commissioner, Dr Caroline Carney, Senior Analyst, and Claire Murdoch, Head of Fiscal Sustainability and Public Funding. So before we move to questions, I invite Professor Roy to make a brief opening statement. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having us here today. So 2 years ago, we published our first Fiscal Sustainability Report focusing on demographics. And this report extends that analysis, but with a particular focus on health. And demographic change is still central to our projections. And you'll remember that 2 years ago, we projected Scotland's population to decline. Because of that, the number of deaths exceeding the number of births is projected to continue. However, our updated analysis now includes a higher level of migration, consistent with higher levels of net inflows of people into Scotland. And as a result, Scotland's overall population is now expected to grow slightly over the next 25 years before it plateaus. Crucially, however, Scotland's share of the UK population is projected to continue to decline, falling from 7.9% of the UK population in 2029-2030 to 7.2% in 2074-75. What matters too for the public finances is how these projections look for different age groups. The population aged 16 to 64, those who have traditionally been most likely to be working in the labour force, is projected to fall in Scotland in the next 50 years. In contrast, we see an increase in the elderly population. As an example of that, over the next 50 years, the number of people aged over 85 is projected to double. We see a similar trend of an ageing population across the UK, but Scotland's population is projected to age earlier. Indeed, over the next 25 years, Scotland's share of the UK over 75 and over 85 populations are projected to increase, even though our overall share of the UK population will fall. And all this has implications for the public finances. Typically, as we show in our report, demand for key public services such as health and social care increase with age. Other pressures too, including rising costs of delivery, add additional pressures to health budgets over time. Assuming that policy remains unchanged and projecting devolved spending and funding based upon demographic change, trends in health spending alongside society becoming wealthier through time, we see a gap opening up between funding and spending. In our analysis, we highlight how much of this gap emerges because of funding pressures emerging at the UK level, but we also highlight how some of the budget gap is driven by pressures that are specific to Scotland, which, because of our demographic profile, are more acute over the next 25 years. We combine the trends we have projected for Scottish funding and spending with an OBR scenario for returning UK debt to a more sustainable path. Under that scenario, Scottish spending will now exceed funding by an average of 11.1% over the next 50 years. And this gap starts relatively small but grows over time. We also finally took a look at health as the biggest and fastest projected growing area of Scottish Government spending. We produced two scenarios in our report to illustrate the potential links between the health of the population and the public finances. Our Better Health scenario shows that if the Scottish population were healthier, and if people in Scotland lived as long as their counterparts in England, then this can help mitigate some, but not all, of the projected annual budget gap. Of course, if the health of the Scottish population worsened, it would make the annual budget gap more negative. And we conclude that the Scottish Government needs to plan to manage these pressures. We welcome the Government's decision to publish a fiscal sustainability delivery plan at the end of the month, at the end of next month, and we hope that this will set out plans to address these fiscal challenges.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very helpful opening statement, Professor Roy. I mean, I think the very first graph on page 3, I think, and the comments next to it, I think, sum it up. Health spending could grow 36% now to 40% by 2030 to an astonishing 55% of the devolved Scottish budget. And I think that's something that really there has to be a real concern about, and look to see how we can possibly change that. But I'm just wondering, I mean, I know, John, I don't want to steal his thunder, but John always comments about how can we project things 50 years into the future, when there's so many changes. And 2 years ago, in the last 2 years, you've changed your projection of the Scottish population by 15%, which is pretty drastic in 2 years, to be honest. I mean, it's about you know, about an 800,000 people more you're now predicting to be in Scotland than you did only a couple of years ago. So I think this is understandably one is concerned about how such a huge difference can be made in to projections in such a short period of time, really.
So a couple of things. So we rely on ONS projections for population. So we use essentially how they update their population numbers, and that happens on a regular basis. So these population projections will change marginally, I think, in the next, when the next iteration comes around. And actually, if you remember one of the conversations we had about why you thought it was useful for us to do more regular updates was because population projections could change, and it'd be useful to see how much the story might change if you have differences in population. A couple of things that I think would be are important not to lose sight of in that the fundamental driver of what's happening to our population, deaths exceeding birth, the fact that our population is ageing, hasn't changed. What's actually really changed is the ONS's assumptions about what's happening to migration, and crucially, I'm much more optimistic about migration into the UK over the next few years. And then essentially what's happening is Scotland is getting its share of that. And that's essentially the big change that's happened between the two elements. So it's not really a massive change in the structure of the population. It's not a change in the ageing of the population. It's really just a change in migration. So while that number seems big, it's relatively marginal in terms of the overall story in terms of what does this mean for the public finances, which is that our population is ageing. It's ageing earlier than the UK, so there's a particular acute issue over the next 25 years, which have big implications for the public finances.
I don't know if optimistic is the right word to use if we're talking about the UK population projected to grow to something like 82 million. I mean, that's like 15 million more than it already is. You know, I think England is already pretty much, concreted over large chunks of it, so I'm not convinced that people will necessarily welcome that. But in terms of Scotland, what you're suggesting is that 20,000 migrants a year on average will come in net and 10,000 from other parts of the UK. But given the fact that, most political parties, certainly at Westminster level, are trying to reduce migration, how confident are you that these figures will be maintained?
Well, that's a risk that we always set out in our assumptions, is that we look at, so we rely on the ONS assumptions, and they essentially look at recent trends and project that forward. But clearly this can change. And again, I think when we highlighted in our CEF back in December, we were saying that there's a risk around the migration forecast, because if migration falls across the UK and Scotland takes a similar share of that, then that has a potential impact on the economy and the potential tax revenues. So again, in terms of, we could be here in 2 years' time when we do our update for you on this as well, saying, well, actually, look, if you look at recent trends, there has been a cutback in migration into the UK, and therefore the overall population projection for Scotland is now less positive, less growing than where we were sitting here just now. But the key point is it wouldn't change the underlying story, which is that Scotland's share of the UK population is projected to decline and our population is ageing. And these two factors are the things that are the biggest issue for the public finances.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the issues I was going to ask next, but you've answered that already. So, I mean, in terms of the projected Scottish devolved public spending, you've said is unsustainable. And basically you're saying accounting for a possible UK government response to its fiscal sustainability pressures widens the gap from the 1.2% on average over the projection to 11.1%. So I wonder if you can talk us through that, because I think that's quite fundamental, and you've touched on it on a number of occasions throughout the report.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to say. So the first thing is that, and we might get on to how robust our projections over 50 years and forecasts, etc. But a large part of this is essentially largely arithmetic about saying, well, look, if you look at the cost of delivering public services across different age profiles, so there's a really good chart on page 54 of our report where we look at resource health spending by age bracket, and you see that it just increases as people on average get older. So people roughly between 16 and 60, the average spend on health is around about between £2,000 and £4,000 per person. Once you get up to 85 plus, that's about £14,000 per person. So it's simple arithmetic that if you have more people of above 75, above 85, in the future, that means that more money is going to have to go on just delivering exactly the same spending commitment, and we might get into some of the implications in the economy more generally. So that's the really important demographic element. The key bit is that this isn't just something that is unique to Scotland. Actually, most high-income countries, all high-income economies around the world are facing an ageing population. And I should just say, before I forget to put it on the record, the fact that we are ageing as a population is a really good thing. I mean, it reflects, great progress in society, healthcare, the economy, etc. But it does come with a fiscal cost. And what that matters is that means that is a challenge at the UK level. So, of course, crucially, still the biggest element of the Scottish budget is the block grant. So, therefore, what happens at the UK level in terms of its ageing population and how the UK government responds, that has an implications on future block grants. And that's where we talk about in the report quite a lot about the driver of how the UK might respond to that kind of ageing population has an impact on the block grant. But we then also highlight, even within that, what are the unique challenges within Scotland. And I think the bit that we've tried to pull out much more in this report is that if you look at just the demographics between Scotland and the rest of the UK, there's a really interesting dynamic that's going to happen over the next 25 years, which is that our share of the elderly population in the UK is going to increase. And that means that in many ways, over the next 2 to 3 parliaments, the pressure on public spending is going to be more acute in Scotland relative to England, simply because we've got a higher share of that elderly
although there is an element of rebalancing later on in the forecast.
Yeah, exactly. So they catch up. The rest of the UK catches up with our population.
I mean, I think the issue, of course, is not just about how long we live, but how long we live in good health. And I think that's a major issue. Certainly in the area I represent, the average age at which people go out of good health is as low as 56. So people can live maybe 15, 20 years in ill health. And I think that's a major issue for the individuals concerned, never mind the budgetary considerations. But if we look at what you said in terms of annual budget gaps, I'm keen on looking at that particular issue specifically a wee bit more. You've said we also assume the UK government does not take action to address its own fiscal sustainability challenges. Why wouldn't it do that?
Yeah. So this is, I think, the two types of results that we have here. So what we do is to build up our analysis, we say, OK, let's assume that government doesn't change its policies. So we still continue to fund spending on health and social care, etc., just as normal. And what we do is then we get the first assessment, which is the bit that we think is the unique challenge to Scotland, that budget gap there. So that gap would never exist in the sense that the government can't borrow, so it's got to essentially adjust for that. But it's just an illustration of where we think that funding will lag behind spending. And we do that assuming that government policy doesn't change. And that gives our kind of first set of results where we talk about the average gap of about 1.2% over the next 50 years. But that obviously assumes that essentially the UK government policy is not changing, but that's not sustainable. And that's what the OBR are very clear about, is that the UK current trajectory on its fiscal policy isn't sustainable over the long run. And so what we then do is we say, OK, what might be the implications of them becoming sustainable? And we take one of the OBR scenarios about coming back down to a debt level, and we assume that adjustment split between spending and revenue. And that's where the additional the budget gap comes from, and that's ultimately the biggest driver of the budget gap over the next few decades, is essentially the fact that both the UK and Scotland's population is ageing, and it's how the governments respond to that that's going to be the biggest pressure.
I mean, what I find really interesting in paragraph 29 is you've said, under a scenario of worse population health, we project the annual budget gap to reach -4% by the end of the projection. But if it's improved by better population health, it could be a positive 6.2%.
And I guess that's one of the key things that we're trying to highlight in the report. So just to be clear, these comparisons are based on a unique Scottish element. You still have the additional bit on the UK. So you'll see at the end of the report, we talk about how the overall budget gap will be impacted between the better and worse scenarios. And that's why I was saying a better scenario helps you. It doesn't solve everything, but it certainly helps you address that. And I think the really interesting thing about when we talk about the better health scenario that is exactly getting to your point, convener, where you're talking about, what happens if we improve healthy life expectancy. That doesn't just lead to less demand on public services, it means more participation in the labour market and a greater set of tax revenues flowing in. On a worst case scenario, that then potentially becomes worse. So spending goes up and the economy becomes more negative. And I guess the key thing that we're trying to say in our report is that health isn't just like the bit that follows the public finances. Actually, one of the big drivers of the public finances over the long run is health. And if you can improve health, if we can improve the health of Scotland's population, that isn't just good for the individuals or society. It will actually save you money, significant money over the medium to long term.
I think it's worth emphasising in the sense that the fiscal gains are really coming from that healthy life expectancy. That's That's because that just reduces your spend per head as a result. If you can have people in good health for longer, so if we're just putting our fiscal hats on only, that's the thing you would focus on, is how to improve healthy life expectancy.
I mean, one of the issues I think that's of concern now, and when you're looking at potentially up to 55% of the Scottish budget being spent on health, all else being equal by 2075, is the fall in productivity in health. So if you think about health, and you've talked about this in the document, productivity in manufacturing, for example, through technological innovation, etc., is a lot easier to grow than in areas that are labour intensive, such as health. But we've seen a reversal of that. We've seen a quite substantial reduction in productivity across the health service, across the UK, since the pandemic. So what impact has that had, A, on your projections, and B, do you expect that to be turned around over the next 5 or 10 years?
So a couple of things I would say on that. So there's two issues I think that are important to separate out. So there's almost like the kind of the unique elements, or what's been happening since the pandemic, where we've seen this significant fall in UK productivity within the health sector. I think it's talking about 10% down since relative to the pandemic, and that is proving really significant challenges in terms of outcomes, and you see that across all the key measures of health outcomes in Scotland. And if we just take that on its own, that just means that the challenge of addressing the budget gap will become, or at least the potential policy is neutral. The outcomes that people get is going to be more difficult over the long term, because essentially, in order to have the same quality of outcomes, then if you can't get productivity going up, you're going to have to spend even more into that. So that makes the challenge worse.
Well, that's what is happening now. We're spending more in the NHS, but there are fewer operations than there were before the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think, the second bit is, I think, is really important within health, is the bits we talk about in our report, where actually, even if you can address that, so let's assume we can address that, there's just challenges in healthcare around improving productivity over the long run based on a whole experience of that. And that comes down to just things like what you're talking about with the Auditor General, about technological improvements, for example, are really helpful. They can help a lot. But ultimately, the ability to get productivity gains in something like health is actually really quite difficult, because it depends on caring. It depends on people being looked after. It depends upon the high quality delivery of that service. So there's an underlying challenge within health as an area of the public sector that is always just difficult to get productivity improvements at the same scale as the wider economy. But then on top of that, we've added to that about the particular challenges we've faced post-pandemic, about the fall in productivity within the NHS. I
mean, in terms of treatments, though, what impact will that have? So, for example, actually, the Crossback with Life Sciences, we had a presentation from the Chief Exec of Moderna, came all the way from Texas for the meeting, frankly, and he was talking about RNA messenger being used for individual cancer patients, so they actually develop a cure for your specific DNA as opposed to anyone else's. Costs an absolute fortune. They didn't put a price on it, of course, because it's still at development stage. Looking very, very, very promising, particularly for people who are very advanced stages of cancer. But we also have things like, for example, Ozempic, and there could be a cost benefit of that. It might cost £1,500 a year, but if it saves hearts and strokes, it can actually save a lot of money in the long run. Potentially. So, how do you balance these kind of developments out in terms of a cost benefit analysis, because we also just one other thing is to say that they've developed a new cure for sickle cell anemia out in Roslyn, and apparently it costs 1.6 million a patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So some treatments will be very cost beneficial. Obviously, there's quality of life issues. We're talking about individual human beings. But I'm just from an economic point of view, how do you, when you're doing your forecasting into an area as complex as health, how do you balance these different innovations?
So I'll have a first shot and then maybe come to Caroline and Claire on specifics, and then Francis might want to come in and some general comments as well on that, because I think that is really important. I mean, just to be clear, so what we do in our report is that we essentially we rely a lot on the analysis OBR have done. Part of that is because they've done quite a lot of work on it. Part of it is we want to have the same assumptions, so we're not telling you something that is different and then you unpick it and it's just because we've used different assumptions to them in this. So we draw a lot on the evidence about what's looked at historical trends in terms of like rates of productivity in the health service, the average technological cost increases that pick up. And you're right, some of these are sometimes you might have something that can be a cost saving, so relatively small costs in terms of a drug or innovation that can then have lasting impacts over time. But then you're right against that, you've got some things that could be really, really, really expensive and will generate more modest benefits, or might actually then be an improvement that then potentially leads to further expenditure further down the line, because you're able to catch things earlier, but that means there's increased operations and demands, etc. on that. So what we do is we look at all the evidence and we essentially take an average in all of that. Again, you can play around with that. You can play around with the slightly different numbers, but again, what we say is, look, actually there will be a cost in here that will grow over time, which is what we have to account for and what we have to address. I don't know if you want to maybe expand on that, Caroline, on what we do.
I don't have much else to add, except the approach we take, this additional 1% that you'd mentioned earlier, which includes the Baumol effect and technological advancements and long-term chronic disease. This is based on what has been the long-term trend in the UK and other countries as well. And it's an approach used by other IFEs doing these types of projections as well. And I think like that kind of point you made about the 1.6 million sickle cell anemia cure, getting to the technological advancement points, that will eventually come down in price, but it will be rolled out to more patients, and that's the kind of thing.
Such a small number of patients, it may not. It's not like a video recorder that used to cost £1,000 and 5 years later it was 20 quid. I'm not convinced that it will always do it in certain areas where it's
maybe
rare
not.
Conditions.
But with some of those kind of advancements, I think we've just spoken about cataract surgery before. Things get rolled out more. I think going maybe back to we use this way that we kind of project the health spending. We do this on the UK side as well as the Scottish side, and it's going back to, I guess, what's different for Scotland is the demographics in how we kind of get that Scottish specific risk. So how we approach those changes is kind of the same on the funding and spending side as well.
I think fundamentally, it is productivity in health is very slippery concept, and therefore I think that you're right to highlight. The measures we use are sort of slightly straightforward. How long you wait for an operation, how long this happens. But clearly, there are things like what's the value of a screening program compared to a intervention later, and that becomes harder because you can say how effective it is, but how much money it's worth is it's not only economically difficult, it's morally quite difficult to get into that world. So I think normally what happens with health productivity, we're comparing interventions in health and saying which one is worth doing compared to the ones we're already doing. But you're right, more broadly, productivity in health is a very slippery concept.
I mean, a couple of years back, I spoke to the chief executive of my local health board who basically said that prior to the pandemic, they used to do 4 operations in a theatre per day on average, now it's 3. And I said, well, why is that then? And they said, well, now we do a thorough deep clean in between operations. And I thought, well, did you not do that before? No, I mean, so you know, but I mean, that itself is a 25% reduction. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, that's really impactful.
I mean, that's the interesting comparison to say, you know, all of that infection control that had to be implemented in COVID did save a huge number of lives, and therefore you could argue that was a incredibly productive intervention. You know, there was a huge number of lives saved as a result of people wearing masks, you know, wearing gloves, washing their hands carefully, and all that sort of thing, which was pretty low cost to do, but delivered a great outcome. But of course, officially, that's measured as a reduction in productivity because the queues for interventions for operations lengthen. So, you know, that sort of comparison is always very, very complicated.
Okay. I mean, in terms of the funding overview, you know, I mean, and you've talked about in terms of figure 3.1, the detail after it, that you see that the funding to 2075-45 will grow in real terms, from 65 to 159 billion will be the funding for the Scottish Parliament, but expenditure will grow from 65 to 160 billion. So there's only a billion of a difference really there, and it is quite an astronomical, more than doubling of expenditure. So what you've said basically there is because of greater expectation of the quality of services. But how can we possibly, be able to deliver that massive increase in spend and revenue over such a period of time? I mean, if we don't have the productivity growth over the next 50 years.
Well, and just to be clear about what we're talking about when we look at that kind of funding and trend, part of it is we're saying that it's actually not sustainable, because that's once you think about this huge increase in expenditure that is needed, this huge increase in funding that is needed is actually not sustainable, and that's where we stray into the work that OBR have done and said, well, if you just continue as you're doing at the moment, your debt levels will continue to increase.
Yeah, to well over 270%.
Yeah, so if you want to start to get that back to a balance, then these numbers are, you basically have to address some of that. And I think where you think we end in the report, and this is where we hopefully pass it over to the policymakers and the politicians and all of this, some of it is around, I think what we're saying is, look, actually thinking about improving the health isn't just being about health, it's about actually improving the public finances, and how you do that and make that structural change is fundamentally important. Secondly, there's then the element about how do you grow your economy, how do you actually support the tax revenues that are ultimately going to deliver all of this. But at the end of the day, it comes down to a really quite difficult decision about saying, look, you've built public services on the projection of a population where essentially you've had large numbers of people in the workforce with a relatively small number of elderly people that you're then supporting through the tax system. Once you start to flip that pyramid over, there are then fundamental, quite big questions about how do you prioritise public services, what public services do you prioritise, and essentially a conversation about how you're funding, because as I said in one of my early answers, a lot of this is arithmetic. It's essentially saying that if you want to continue to deliver the same level of service, and it costs more as we age, then actually the level of spending that's going to be needed to maintain that is actually going to increase.
Okay, I mean, one of the things you've said in paragraph 4.9 is that there has been a decline in Scottish healthy life expectancy since 2014-16. Now, that was looking at the 1921 figures, and COVID may have an impact on that. But given the fact that, for example, things like smoking and all that's decreased, younger people are not, the boozers that people in, for example, your generation were, Graham. Why is that actually happening, if you think about it? I mean, I think of the rubbish that we used to get fed in the 60s and 70s, compared to the quality of food and things like that we have now. The air's cleaner and all the rest of it. So is it because of mental health or other issues? Why is it that healthy life expectancy has not continued to improve?
Yeah. Maybe I hand over.
Poverty is also lower than it was a few years back.
I hand over the team because we spent quite a bit of time speaking to public health academics and public health officials in that. I mean, a quick answer, and maybe Caroline and Claire might want to come in on this. I mean, some of this is that you're right. We did see really quite significant improvements in life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, for a long period of time, and a lot of that was doing exactly the basic stuff: improvements in quality of housing, improvements in air quality, improvement, all of that stuff, treatment. That knowledge has helped improve. So there are some people who think that yes, it was always going to tail off slightly and become more difficult to get that additional improvement in life expectancy. But there is also a lot of work that's now going out into, and it's kind of related to the pandemic. Clearly, the pandemic had an impact on it. But a lot of this stuff that's arising around the so-called like deaths of despair and the effects that are coming through that. And again, this is not just a Scottish thing, it's a broader UK thing, where you're seeing declines in mental health, you're seeing instances of drug abuse rising, you're seeing effects of poverty feeding through to life expectancy. This is a big thing in the US. We've seen the trends in the UK as well. We cite a couple of studies that are looking into that. And you're seeing a general decline in overall well-being in society, that people are beginning to say, well, hold on a minute, this is actually quite highly correlated with healthy life expectancy, and are these effects leading to one another? And that, I think, is some of the more interesting bit. And it may come on to some of the stuff that we do around increasing things like disability payments that we're seeing, the big inflow of that. Is that a signal, an early warning signal of things that might be coming further down the line in terms of healthy life expectancy? But don't you feel maybe expand on some of the conversations that you had with colleagues?
I think with a healthy life expectancy, it's the measure is a combination of life expectancy itself and self-reported data from people on how they report their health. So we know we can see the trend in life expectancy, which has plateaued in recent years, and I think during COVID had a small blip as well. Then there's the kind of how people report their own health, which has come down in Scotland in the last couple of years. And while I think, as you say, there has been improvements in a lot of kind of health measures like smoking and things like that, but we also know there's other things which have gotten worse, mental health and well-being being one, obesity being another. And I think this has been a trend which has worsened with COVID, but it was also there before that. There isn't, from the conversations we've had, a consensus on exactly why this has happened, but there is consensus on it being a real trend. And you mentioned it was UK-wide, it's outside of the UK as well. I think there's been some papers recently on the kind of change in well-being and happiness, which is like across countries, and the stagnation in life expectancy as well is beyond the UK, not everywhere, but in other contexts too.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the issue of productivity. I mean, in 4.34 paragraph, you talk about it quite a lot. You talk about the increase in expenditure, and it says, despite increased funding and staffing levels, initiatives to improve productivity and outcomes for patients are not yet making progress. Are there any areas in Scotland where there are making progress where, for example, one health boards are struggling can maybe look to other health boards, or indeed out with Scotland, to see what they're doing well, to see how they can actually exchange best practice and take things forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's not something that we've done. That kind of strays out a wee bit of our remit into it.
I wasn't really sure
right
if that would be the case or not. I thought
but you're right. I think again, part of what we're trying to do is say to people, look, actually, it's if we can improve health, then actually this has a public finance saving. So you're right. It's, well, how do we improve productivity in the health service? So how can we learn from other places? How can we learn from each other in there? How can we actually then improve for relatively low cost, people's healthy life expectancy? So some of that's about well-being, some of that's about improving rates on obesity and other elements. How can we tackle things like premature drug deaths, etc.? There's a whole host of things that have really important social health and economic arguments. But what we're trying to do is say, like, actually they have public finance implications as well, and thinking about tackling these sort of things as being an investment in long-term fiscal saving is really crucial
I realise I've been asking questions for quite a while now, so I apologise to colleagues for that. I'll just ask one more and then I'll let everyone in. What you've said, which was quite another really interesting but depressing statistic in paragraph 4.40, is that disability prevalence has risen from 19% of the UK population in 2002-3 to 27% of the population by 22-23 now. And your projections, do you expect that trend to continue, or do you expect it to stay the same or reverse?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'll be looking to hand over to Claire Kelly about what we do, particularly in our report. But broadly speaking, what we do is we essentially take the prevalence at the moment and then just push that forward and change it by age. So we don't make a judgment call, you know, relatively what we would normally do, like in our CEF, where we think about whether it's going to increase or not over the next 5 years. Essentially, we take that and then we just change demographics. So we don't really go into a big judgment call about where we think that's going to get. You know, the rate of self-reporting is going to get bigger or smaller. It will increase over time because once it's embedded in the population, the number will rise, but we don't make a call about whether, you know, disability is going to get worse, but it will increase because we've got a higher proportion in the population.
Okay, thanks very much. The first person to ask questions to the committee will be Liz, to be followed by Craig.
Thank you, and thank you for all the excellent work that you do on updating this. I want to ask about the challenge of trying to measure the effect of putting more money into something to try to improve outcomes against measures that are not money. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm asking this is some years back, it's probably about 10, 12 years now, Reform Scotland did a really interesting study about the amount of money that had gone into education in Scotland, considerable increase in amount of money that had gone into education in Scotland, but actually with declining outcomes at literacy and numeracy and some of the issues. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me, just from building on what the convener is saying, that there are some aspects of putting more and more money into health, which is what's happened in Scotland. Some of the outcomes are not encouraging at all, whereas obviously some are. How easy is it to get a handle on the effectiveness of measures that are financial, i.e. down to more money being put in, against other measures which are having a positive effect but are nothing to do with money? How easy is it to handle that?
So it's a great question, and I guess the answer is it's very difficult. And I guess we've really been talking about this. You know, Christy, I mean, you mentioned Reform Scotland. Christy obviously talked about this. What's that? That's 12, is it? 13
no, it's
years
more than
ago?
that.
14 years ago? 2010, 2011.
16,
yeah, so we've been talking about this for a very long time, and I think the point is, I think what our stuff is trying to do is give more evidence to say, look, actually this really needs to happen, because if we don't do this budget gap we're talking about, it won't happen. It just means that we're going to cut spending or increase taxes, and we're going to have poorer outcomes as a result. So it's almost like this has a real kind of impact, and we really need to address it. I think this gets into a bit the thing where I think there's a broader comment, and this does start to stray out where we would have a significant role in, is about this whole thing you were chatting about earlier with the Auditor General about what's the value of things like the medium-term financial strategy, what's the value of things like the long-term fiscal sustainability report, beyond simply being the trend stuff. So we can do that. We can give the evidence about what the trends and what needs to happen. But it's where's the evidence about the policies having the impact, and where is the policy evaluation, where's the real rigour in good policy making. And also I think the courage to maybe say, well, we've tried something, it's not had the impact that it would have done. We've got the evidence that it hasn't had the impact. Where can we potentially get the evidence that other areas are going to work? I wouldn't underestimate how difficult that is, because things have potentially long lags that effects are going to come in. You're right, where you can potentially look at the value of regulation or guidance versus spending or taxation, and that's where it is always quite tricky to do. I guess the point is that having a really robust framework for how you do that, and you can actually start to evaluate, you can run pilots, you can test the effects, you can look at how people's behaviours change. I think that's the bit that's perhaps missing, is that really hard-nosed edge about evidence, evidence informing policy.
That's very helpful. I mean, the other side of the coin, but very much a related part of this, is the fact that there is an increasing imbalance between the working population and the dependent population, which is what you've been flagging up. And if we are going to try to close some of the fiscal gap, the other part of the policy has to try to ensure that the working population is able and willing to work, apart from anything else, but being able to widen the tax base and return the revenues that we need in order to fill some of the gap. And there's lots of discussion at the moment about that working population and how we actually manage to attract more people back into the workforce. And again, I don't want you to comment on the policy because I know you won't do that, but in terms of analysing where policy is effective in getting more people back into the labour market who can work, should work, how easy is it to measure the effectiveness of these policies?
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think it's challenging, but it's not impossible. The bit I'd add to the bit you said as well is not just getting people into work, but it's into the high quality jobs. So it's not just creating jobs, it's actually creating high value jobs, which under our fiscal framework really matter for income tax. So thinking about the sectors that you're looking to attract, think about the investment you're looking to get into all of that. And again, it's entirely possible to do this sort of thing, to look at how you might evaluate a policy. And what I used to do when I was in the Fraser Valley, we evaluated things like the small business bonus, we evaluated things like R&D grants from the Scottish Enterprise, etc. And you could look at, okay, well, for your spend, are you actually getting the outcomes that you would do? And to be fair, this is a bit in general where the UK, and it's not just Scotland, the UK is well behind the best countries in the world about how you do rigorous policy evaluation and analysis to look at, okay, well, what is the best effect of this? So are you collecting the data from day one that can let you see whether or not this is having the desired impact, and then evidence it? And then if it's working, put more money into it or incentivise it a bit more. If it's not, stop, move on to something else.
I think there's always, potential political cost of evaluating a policy after it's been implemented. I mean, it's a policy evaluation before you implement a policy is sort of good practice, but evaluating it after it's been implemented is always a slightly tricky area, and I think there is a tendency to maybe not do as much as could be done.
The OECD's recent analysis about pre-pandemic and post-pandemic working population is interesting as well, because they're flagging up that the UK doesn't come out of this very well, that we've not recovered our pre-pandemic levels either in the UK or in Scotland, whereas a lot of other countries have. Do you have any ideas as to why that has happened?
It's something we can look into. I don't think we've looked specifically on that. The one caveat I would say is, and I'm not dodging the question, I'm always slightly nervous about the data we've got on the UK labour market at the moment. As you know, there's been ongoing issues about the LFS and levels of inactivity in all of that. So there's a slight caution on that. It's something we can take away and have a look at and think about.
It was quite striking in the OECD report that we were not doing very well in relation to other countries, and there must be lessons in that somewhere, that we're not getting enough people back in to the workforce for whatever reason it is. It's, you can't obviously set the policy until you know what the reason is as to why people are not coming back into the labour market in the ways that we would like. Anyway, thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Professor Roy. In terms of, I mean, I must say, I read the report of the weekend and it hardly cheered me up, I must say. I wasn't full of beans. It is quite a depressing picture, but not just for us, but I think for quite a number of Western economies. I just want to perhaps look at how we could make the labour market more productive in Scotland, and also how can we effectively increase productivity on a kind of per capita basis. It strikes me that effectively we've got 3 or 4 different key triggers. You've got lifelong learning, you've got skills, you've got people perhaps working longer or working longer into their older age and working longer in terms of hours. So just to look at one thing in relation to Scotland at the moment, there is this debate that's taking place about the working week and the length of the working week. And you'll have seen, for example, the public sector working week has reduced in this discussion around scaling back perhaps to 4 days rather than 5 days. What potential impact could Scotland working less hours have on our productivity?
Yeah, so it's not something we look at in our report, but I can give some general thoughts on that. So there's two different views about what the effects of that could be. So one is that by reducing the length of the working week or supporting greater flexibility, etc., that could actually have a positive impact upon people's productivity, because it could improve well-being. It could tackle presenteeism, absenteeism. It could make people more dynamic when they're in work, etc. So it could have a positive impact there. There's another argument which actually, that it might have a negative impact because it reduces engagement with staff. It has an impact in terms of workload. It potentially has different implications more broadly about the structure of a labour market. So there's a positive and a negative in that. But then I guess the key point for us purely, again, is from an economic perspective, if you're pulling out an input which is labour input, then you need a pretty big increase in productivity to compensate for that improvement. So even if there's a small improvement in productivity, it has to be significant to offset, for example, if you're going from 5 days to 4 days, a 20% drop in terms of labour input. That's probably a really good one, where the answer to that comes down to, well, you need to try it, evaluate it, and then see what the effect is. I can tell you a good story, and I'm sure probably everyone here has a great story that says it will have an impact on the positive impact on the economy and it will be good, but we really don't know until you actually evaluate it and do it robustly.
It's sort of intriguing that, so France and Germany, which have work fewer hours, they have much higher productivity per hour now. I mean, the causality doesn't need to run from few hours creates productivity. It could be the productivity greater the few hours, and therefore that's the question that is important to try and establish on this.
One of the other issues, obviously, is people working longer into their retirement. Yeah. Certainly, anecdotally, post-COVID, people seem to be wanting to retire earlier, certainly scale back earlier. Mm-hmm. There is an issue in terms of, if you look at productivity by age, it's a kind of humped-based graph. So those in the middle, let's say 40 to 50, probably are the most productive, because as you get older, you've got skills obsolescence, the lack of reskilling, etc. But what more can we do to make sure that those who are older are maintaining their productivity, so that even if they're not working longer, as they get into their 50s and 60s, they are still as productive perhaps as those in their 40s? Yeah,
so it's a really good question, and there is actually quite a bit of work, particularly in the academic community, to actually start to look at actually what reforms are needed, not to deal with like an ageing population, but a workforce that is potentially going to be longer in there. So part of that is thinking about policies or support. I don't mean policies as in government policies. I mean policies for businesses, etc., that help support potentially people to maybe extend their working life. So again, thinking about retraining opportunities, which might not be the norm if you're kind of into your late 50s, early 60s, because in that the presumption would be is, well, you've only maybe got a few more years before you go into retire. So there's something about how businesses move to be much more thinking about, back to your point about skills and education, but thinking about that all through the different aspects of the age profile. Secondly, there's something as well about, and again, colleagues I know look at this around how do you support healthy ageing through the workforce as you get older. So how do you actually have businesses that help have supportive structures for people that is the age that actually can remain in the labour market and remain working for businesses as they progress through. And then ultimately, I guess this is where the flexibility kicks in, where if you get into your late 60s or early 70s, you might not be wanting to work 5 days a week, but you might want to be then thinking about, well, how can I continue to work flexibly and add value to maybe younger people coming through because you've got skills and experience. So I think it's thinking much more about our labour market being much more dynamic and flexible as we get towards retirement age, rather than you hit a retirement age and then that's it.
I think that's because I think most of the, it's the early stage academic evidence is that there is huge potential benefit in the labour force from this group, but it does require this change of mindset. You don't say, well, this person is coming to the end of the line. What's the point of training them? What's the point of reassigning them? All of that stuff that hasn't historically happened needs to start, and there's some evidence already starting to happen, so that you think of the labour force as something that's much more flexible, that doesn't have a sort of sold by date that therefore restricts it. So I think there is given how much bad news we're delivering, I think there's a potential positive from using that longevity to actually raise productivity at higher age groups.
Yeah. One of the critical drivers of productivity, again, or sort of per capita basis, is kind of innovation and entrepreneurship and encouraging people to do that. And we know that those people, again, are most impactful in terms of their productivity to the economy is when I think 45 or something is the average age. What more could we be doing in public policy terms, be that tax or any other incentives, to get people in that kind of age bracket to start thinking, rather than working for somebody, to actually go out there, take risks and become the entrepreneurs who will drive that economic growth?
Yeah, and again, it's a great question, but it's a question I guess we've come back to repeatedly in Scotland over many, ever since devolution. You go back and look at how do we encourage entrepreneurship, how do we encourage innovation, and it's something which we chat about. We have different policy initiatives, but actually have we really turned the dial in a significant way? And again, I think my general answer is that do we generally know the evidence? Have we evaluated? We have lots of schemes maybe to encourage spin-outs from university or to encourage more people to set up their own business, but actually do we really rigorously evaluate, take the time to look at what works and goes over time? A lot of the stuff that comes out, there's a thing called the Productivity Institute, which is a UK-wide initiative, which looks at these sorts of things. A lot of the evidence that they find is that it's actually a lot more of the smaller scale elements which are absolutely crucial to it. So we think there's a big lever that we can pull, but actually what tends to work is things like mentorship, things like support for businesses starting out in the first scale peer-to-peer learning. And that's where I think as the population ages, there can be real value in that. So it's people who've run their business, set up their business, how do they help support new entrepreneurs coming through, and how do you create an effective, kind of incubating structure that self-supports innovation and entrepreneurship? Because you're right, ultimately productivity is one of the key elements to help tackling this.
And just two brief issues before I close. Often inward migration is seen as the panacea here, but if you look at the OECD, they point out to one fundamental flaw in that, which is that migrant population itself is ageing. And also that if you look at the countries from where we would draw skilled talent, often wage growth there is caught up with here. And there's also the moral dimension as to whether or not we should be recruiting qualified doctors from developing countries where they're actually needed. So if you look, forward it's a decade or so, migration may help sustain us over that period, but then there is a change in the underlying issue in relation to migration patterns. So are we leaning in too heavily, do you think, potentially on migration being the solution to the structural demographic problem that we have?
So again, we don't comment on whether it's specific in there, because there's a couple of things in it, and again, we don't go into too much in this report, but we did in our last one a couple of years ago. So on the plus side, things like migration is potentially really positive in terms of things like filling skills gap and helping boost productivity and support that you go into that. But you're right, it comes with, as you higher migration, you have a higher public spending as well. So it's not, from a fiscal perspective, there's an effect in there as well. There's a subtle point, and I know we don't go into this because we will be talking about it for the next 20 minutes while I heard Michelle Thompson's question about explaining the fiscal framework. But interestingly, because of our fiscal framework, the net tax position, because we're protected on kind of weaker population growth, because that's why we set it up, the index deduction per capita, we don't get a massive gain from the fact that we have higher population, because it's protected on the tax because it's tax per capita. So it doesn't really matter. We can have a big increase in the population, but what matters is taxation per capita. So it's the ratio of how our taxes grow relative to our population. So it's not the panacea that if we have migration, that suddenly massively improves Scotland's fiscal position because of the fiscal framework.
Yeah. And obviously something else that can drive productivity is AI, it's robotics, it's the use of technology. I was looking at a graph yesterday, but I couldn't find Scotland or the UK on this graph, but just looking at countries with a significant demographic issue, an ageing population. Korea seemed to be way up to the top in terms of its use of robotics, which is another way of generating economic growth. Where is Scotland and the UK in relation to using that alternative route to prosperity, which is to bring in the robots?
Yeah, we can get robots doing fiscal commission forecasts for you. So I don't know the comparison. Again, that's something we can look into to see about where Scotland does. A couple of caveats I would say, or a couple of things I would say, is that I think there's a broader bit which I didn't get a chance to answer, but I think you alluded to it, that, again, what matters in productivity, yes, it's skills, investment, working longer, but it's also the sectors that we have. So it's thinking about carefully about these high-quality growth sectors that can help generate the high-value jobs, etc., over time. And we know energy, financial services, those types of things are really important. And then tech is obviously another one where you can get relatively high growth, high returns from relatively limited kind of human input. So again, it is a clear opportunity there. It can help you in a lot of public services as well. So there's obviously ways that you can actually deliver public services much more efficiently through digital and on AI, etc. The caveat we talk about is that health is perhaps not one of them, or at least there's a big caveat in there, because as we've spoken about earlier, a lot of the improvements that you might get might actually lead to increased demand or increased costs. So it's not like some other aspects of public services or business services where if you bring in AI or some robotic element, it automatically leads to a significant reduction. In many cases, it might actually lead to increased costs, which is not a bad thing because you're improving outcomes, but it's not an automatic saving on the public finances.
Super. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much. Michelle, to be followed by John.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I've only got a few questions, but my first one is in terms of your observation that your spending projections are based on current policies and don't contain the additional known challenges, i.e. climate change.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm quite clear about it, but obviously it doesn't include any kind of provisioning for either mitigation or adaptation. So it would be useful for us to understand your current thinking as to why that is the case. I'm sure there's several very, very good reasons, but what would need to happen for at least some consideration being given to that, given the very significant anticipated public sector spend?
Yeah. So the first reason that we've separated out climate change is we did a report last year where we just isolated climate change. We looked at adaptation and mitigation, and that was very much with the effect of just looking carefully at the effects around transition to net zero and what the effects might be. And what we're going to try and do with our reports is try and highlight key themes. So we focus on climate change. This year we've done health, and then next year we'll maybe look at another theme in there. So it's, part of it is tactical, that we try and isolate out, just to be clear about the particular points. And also, as Craig Hoy would say, we don't want to maybe make weekend reading too negative, but it's just to highlight the issue. I think the bit that, again, and where I think we'll go next when we start to look at this, perhaps, is this point about interactions. And we started to speculate in our report about saying, look, actually, we're doing it tactically to have climate change and health and demographics, but actually, when you start to think about it, they're really heavily connected. And there's a lot of things that could come through about what might happen if we have, climate emergency, climate disaster in terms of health, what might happen in terms of, demand for public services. We've not looked at that in any great detail, other than we started to speculate out about where these channels would be. But that's certainly an area where I think we're going, right, okay, we probably need to do more work into the future, get more evidence, and that might be like the sort of theme we might pick up in the future.
No, that's very helpful, and I totally appreciate the complexity, because it's not just like making people depressed, it's also could easily become war and peace.
Exactly. And it's trying to isolate out and say this is a big issue. So we need to get people to think about the health of the population for the public finances. We need to think about climate change. We've spoken, I think, when we've been chatting with you about what other topics might be, things like child poverty and inequality. That's another theme we would look at. So again, it'll be useful to pick up the conversation about what we might do next in future fiscal sustainability reports, and where we might pick up some themes.
And I've also got a couple of little compliments for you, which I want you to enjoy, because it doesn't always happen very often. I was pleased to note your terminology, where you note that this can be thought of as a Scottish-specific fiscal sustainability challenge. I think that's considerably more helpful. You'll know I passed comment before in some of the terminology that you use, because it frames Scotland as part of the wider context and some of the issues around the UK economy and fiscal sustainability. And the other observation I had was the kind of age, sex, spending profiles. I think that the development of that is going to be really, really helpful for us to get to greater clarity. So that's a nice bit over. I just wanted to pick up on fiscal sustainability generally, in the light, you would have heard the earlier conversation with the Auditor General, and I think we all agree that we want to see more resolute forward planning via MTFS and whatnot. But against the kind of debt to GDP ratios and the projections up to sort of 2070 of 274% debt to GDP, which is utterly astounding, it re-emphasises my point that the Scottish economy and the fiscal framework, has to be mindful of this. So I suppose my general question is, how on earth do you and indeed government start to fairly reflect the significant implications of that, which is clearly not sustainable, and we may not, we'll see in this UK spending review, but if this is a whole different trajectory, assuming all things being equal and the same kind of focus on economic policy, which could change. But I just appreciate your reflections on that, how you're thinking about that, and how on earth you're going to start to present that with meaning, at least to this committee, if not to the wider public.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, and part of this is, I think, the work that, so what we can do is almost kind of set up the issue, and then it's really required on Parliament and government to really pick up the ball and then run with it and push it. And the inquiry the committee does around, well, that you're right, this isn't sustainable. And again, the key thing that we're saying in our report, this budget gap, it will not exist. It's not that this is going to be a gap we're all going to look at and go, oh, it looks at 11% of spending. What will happen is that spending will just be cut, or taxes, right? It will just, because they'll just have to balance it. And before we know it, we'll see outcomes, really badly impacted. It's almost like this is, and it comes back to my point about whatever scepticism we have about forecasts and projections. A large part of this is essentially just arithmetic. It's just saying this is what's going to happen as our population ages because of the costs that we have. And we really need policymakers, politicians to almost front up to that and not look at what's happening next year, but actually look at what's happening over the long term. Because I think the other subtle point you'll see, I think when you look at like the chart, when we show what happens when you look at fiscal sustainability with the effects in the UK, it starts off small and builds up. So the risk is that you just keep kicking the can down the road, and you think, oh, we'll just balance the budget this year, we'll do a spending review that will last for a couple of years, and then we'll adjust it at the end. But then before you get, not maybe the next Parliament, but the Parliament afterwards, you're starting to look at health outcomes that look radically different from where you were, simply because it's unaffordable. So I think this comes back to my answer to Liz Smith's point. We've been talking about this stuff for a long time. We've been thinking about population ageing will come. It's now here, and it's already having an impact on public service demand.
And just my last wee question, the convener brought it up earlier in terms of disability prevalence. Do you have any sense as to why that is so? Because again, I think it has come up in this committee before, but it just seems quite astounding, the projected increase.
Yeah, I mean, I think, do you want to maybe expand a bit on it, Claire and Caroline? I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, one is, again, back to the point, I think Caroline answered it really well, is about there's a consensus that it's happening, that it's a trend, but actually what is driving it? And there's some things linked to obviously social media, and we see some countries taking more aggressive interventions about the use of social media for young people, etc. Obviously the pandemic's had an impact. Some of it might also be there's perhaps decreasing stigma about people, saying I've got potential mental health issues and therefore accessing support, whereas in the past you would have you wouldn't have raised it. So there's quite a few kind of areas of speculating, but I don't know whether Caroline, Claire, you want to expand on what we track.
So in this analysis, what we've done is part of it is you see an increase in prevalence because you have an ageing population, and a lot of conditions worsen with age, and you have greater claims. But one of the changes that we've made this time is that at the moment we're seeing higher prevalence levels amongst children and young people, and we assume that that will translate not as a constantly increasing prevalence rate amongst young people, but that actually we're going to see a cohort of people moving into the working age payments who have higher prevalence levels as that current cohort of young people age. So that slightly pushes up the prevalence. I mean, why is a very hard question to answer. Yeah. What we can tell you is what we're seeing and how we're kind of projecting that. But it's definitely something that from a public finance point of view is concerning. And also, you know, if it's predominantly related to mental health and mental illness, that's not something that you want to see as a society either, albeit if it's to do with stigma reduction, then that's a positive thing. But there are implications.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, I found out this morning that I have a mental illness apparently by watching the news. It said hoarding apparently is apparently some kind of mental illness, because I'm thinking I've got a huge big library. You know, does that mean I'm a hoarder because I've been collecting books since I was at school? So one wonders about these kind of definitions actually and how realistic they actually are, and they may be impactful on individuals, but we have to look at what the wider impact is on society in terms of how we define some of these things, I think. Let's see, John, before by Ross.
Thanks, Convener. Michelle Thompson mentioned the debt, and that seemed to be a difference between the UK's sustainability or lack of and Scotland's, because obviously debt's not an issue for us, we just have to cut our spending. And these kind of stark figures that at the moment we're at, is it 98% of GDP and potentially going up to 274%. I mean, is there a kind of psychological level where the UK government will have to do something? I mean, I would have thought 100% was quite psychological, and that to actually get 100% is quite a big deal. But, I mean, can you forecast, or does the OBR forecast, you know, that when we get to 150, suddenly the UK is going to change direction, or is it just a gradual thing, or anything in there?
Yeah. So maybe like Francis come in on this. This has been quite a controversial bit in the economics community about what is the optimal level of debt, and some people have a view that actually you could actually have a much higher level of debt, and some people would argue that actually no, you couldn't, because it means you're paying debt interest, which means you're taking it away from public services. So given it's controversial, I'll ask Francis to...
Professor Braden will give us the figure.
To answer that.
Okay, number is no. No, I mean, there's two things. First of all, so weirdly, economists sort of don't have it now, because often if we talk about fiscal sustainability, it's simply, can I keep my debt stable? It doesn't say what the number is you're keeping stable. It just says, if you can keep it stable, you're sustainable. However, you're right. I mean, it's a bit like how you think about a firm. You know, there's a point at which you get into financial distress where your credit rating goes down, where people are leaving. You know, your best people are leaving because they're worried about the nature of your economy. You know, so it's a bit like a company on the verge of bankruptcy. That sort of kicks in. So there is, but it doesn't sort of kick in like, wow, suddenly we've hit that moment. It's just a very slow and steady progress. But again, it highlights why this sort of discussion is really important, because this is the time to address the issue, because it does get increasingly difficult the longer you leave it. And so I think that's the point, that it will just gradually creep on you, up on you. These financial distress issues will hit you, will just grow and grow, and then just make the spiral even worse. So dealing with them early is always better.
Because it's clear from all your papers that if the UK makes a major change in the way it's doing things, and borrows less presumably, then that will have a big impact in Scotland. But I'm kind of picking up that you don't know when that might happen, and it's very difficult to predict when that might happen.
I mean, I guess the way the current government's thinking about it in the UK is, say, if we can get a bit more growth, that will solve the problem in the most painless way possible. I guess that's that is true. If you can do it, that's the way to do it.
And again, just to illustrate one thing, which again we highlight in the report, is the interaction between UK government and Scottish government, and how important the outlook for the Scottish government depends upon what happens at the UK level. So you're right, debt is one issue. So what might future UK governments do to potentially consolidate? But then what matters as well is a decision for them about, do they potentially change, or at least make a lot of the adjustments on reserved areas or in devolved areas. So, for example, do they basically say we're going to save a lot of money by reducing the pensions? You know, that would have an impact on people in Scotland, but it wouldn't have an impact on the Scottish budget. If instead they say, well, actually, no, we're going to keep pensions, at a relatively higher level, but cut health spending, that would have an impact. And similarly, there's a balance between how much do they say, well, we're going to tax more, or we're actually going to make it more on the spending side. So what we do in the report is just be neutral and say, here is a scenario that shows you that actually, that even under any plausible thing, there's going to be a big, essentially, effect coming through whatever future UK governments do to the budget of the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government's budget.
Okay, thank you. In one of the sections, or 4, I think, of the report, determinants of health spending, and talk about demographics, talk about other cost pressures. But I was particularly interested in this one called income effect, which seems to say that as people get wealthier, their expectations increase, and therefore they've got an increased demand for health. Yeah. And if you can tell me if that's a kind of correct summary of it. Because earlier on we had the idea that, which would seem obvious, that if people's health improves, we don't need to spend so much on the health service. Yeah. But this seems to say the opposite, that as people get better off and their health, or it might be improving in some ways, but in other ways, we just need to spend more money.
So some of that is, so there's a number of effects that we talk about. So one of the things is the things like productivity in the health and the detail around that, and technology and long-term conditions we focus about. The point I think about the bit about income effects and what's happening to how the economy changes impacts on health. I think there's 2 important elements to it. So firstly is that there's just this general trend that actually as people become wealthier, as economies grow, people value health as being one of the most important things of a more prosperous economy. So therefore that naturally leads to health expenditure increasing because people are willing to put some of that growth into health. There's a second element as well, which is a more technical element, in that we assume, and we do this a lot and for a lot of our public spending elements, is that as the economy grows, that puts pressure on wages within that sector to grow, to maintain the level. Because otherwise, if we didn't do that, you'd essentially have wages in the health service declining relative to every other wage that was going up. So we essentially assume that actually, yes, you're going to have to continue to pay, you're going to have pay growth for doctors, nurses, health workers, etc., because you've got a growing economy. And to keep pace with every other worker, that has to have increased spending, and that leads to a pressure on the health service. I would just say it's not a pressure like an additional pressure, because the economy is essentially paying for it, but it's still something which we have to account for in terms of what might drive spending over time.
So, I mean, me being a little bit pessimistic, as I think maybe some of my colleagues are as well today, I mean, it just kind of it seems to me that however well we do, and however much we spend, and however healthy the population becomes, the demand for health service is just going to grow and grow and grow. I mean, we're never going to be able to meet it. There's never going to be a time when supply equals demand. Yeah. It seems to me, I mean, you can absolutely disagree with me, but I mean, we've already mentioned mental health and obesity, which I think when I was younger weren't talked about much or weren't there. And I mean, something else is going to turn up. If we sort obesity and we sort mental health, it'll be something else tomorrow, won't it?
Yeah. But part of this is a trend. If you look over time, more and more money in most high-income economies is going into health, because that is the trend in healthcare in there. And it comes back, I guess, to that, in the demographics, it comes back to that point I was making earlier on about you had essentially a pyramid that was essentially, you had large numbers of people in working age population essentially funding relatively expensive healthcare for a smaller elderly population. Particularly in Scotland over the next 25 years, that pyramid is going to look quite different, where you have fewer people in working age population and a higher proportion of people who are demanding healthcare as they get older. So that is going to open up conversations. But if demand for healthcare is going to increase and it's going to run ahead of funding, there's then the questions about, well, how do you manage that increase? And that's things like healthy life expectancy, etc. But it's not going to be everything. There's then questions about taxation, and do we have to have more funding going into into the health service? Or then actually then what do you do around potentially difficult choices about elements that you're going to spend less on? I mean, the one thing we do, without going into detail, but this is balanced, so we're not just saying that because of demographics, spending always increases. So if you look at our projection on education, for example, because of demographics, we actually think that will fall. Yes. So there will be some savings in that context that could...
I just think in health, I think it will keep going up.
This concept of the healthy life expectancy does give you potential to actually make some savings in health, in the sense that if people are healthy longer and have a very short period of illness, I mean, this is sounding a bit morbid, but that reduces the health spending significantly, because it is that long periods of illness that really obviously are very costly to the health service.
Well, I imagine the Health Committee looks at this a bit, so I'll leave that one just now. I mean, what about other countries? Because what can we learn from them? I think that there's some doubt as to why life expectancy has not kept increasing here, but you make the comment that it actually has in Japan. And I mean, I read an article recently. I mean, Poland seemed to have an even worse problem than we do with an ageing population and people leaving the country, and they're not going to be enough people for the army. Germany and Russia also in similar places. I mean, where are we in the whole scheme of things? And are there lessons we should be learning from other countries like Japan?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and this might be something which, again, in terms of, I don't know whether there has been inquiries or people looked into it in a significant way about, from, within Health Committee and etc., about how Scotland's comparing relative to other countries. But I think we make it quite clear at the start of the report as well, is that, all high-income economies are facing this ageing of the population, and there are some countries which are even more significant position. We mentioned Korea as an example. One of the reasons why Korea is so heavily into tech and AI, etc., is that their population is actually projected to decline quite rapidly over the next few years and decades. So they're almost ahead of us in the scheme of things. And you look around Europe, and you're right, Poland, other countries all have an ageing population too. So this isn't a unique thing that's unique to Scotland. And there's something about how do we learn from other countries that are dealing with it. But they're in exactly the same boat. They're in the same difficult situation. And you saw the example maybe 3 or 4 years ago when France tried to increase the pension age, and it led to protests, and it had to be rolled back there. So this isn't just unique to Scotland. It's similar to everyone. It doesn't make it any easier because we're going to be faced with it.
Would I be right in saying that no country has succeeded, despite financial incentives, in increasing the birth rate?
I don't know. I mean, whether there's something we can.
I think I saw Finland had tried to give an incentive.
It's very difficult to do, given the demographics of the population.
Age population, I think it's important to separate. There's two effects going on here. There's one about the baby boomers, like me, who are just sort of travelling through, a big bulge of us travelling through, and we're going to just inevitably raise the average age just because we're going through the system. And then there is the ageing, the birth and death of the population generally, and that will change the population structure. And the key issue that's being dealt with, that's driving ageing at the moment, is the bulge, is the baby boomer bulge.
Okay, and the final area I just wanted to touch on was, I don't see very much about the mention of preventative spend in here. Now, in one sense, it's all preventative, because if we spend on health and improve the health, that is kind of preventative. But is there an issue with how we spend the health money? If we put more into GPs and primary care and cut off the hospitals a bit, would that in the long run have a benefit, or have you looked at that?
So we don't go into the detail of that, other than to say this is potentially what you would do. And I think this is where it starts to then hand over into the government. And I know they have plans in the summer and health to actually do much more about their long-term strategy around that. But I guess our point is that if you can do it, coming back to the point about evaluation of what works and what doesn't work, if you can do it and you can improve healthy life expectancy, this has a public finance implication. One subtle point, which again just might be useful for your thinking, is that a lot of what we talk about prevention is prevention and investment at a very early age. I think the bit that's really interesting for Scotland, if you look at our report over the next 25 years, that's the bit that's really acute for us. So yes, there is about prevention at an early age, but there's something about what can you do now to the population that is already kind of here, that's maybe in the workforce, to try and make sure that they improve their healthy life expectancy, so you can improve the health healthy life expectancy of 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, because in 25 years' time, they'll be the ones that will be on current projections, the ones that will be demanding more in terms of health.
So things like alcohol, tobacco, obesity,
exactly.
all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Natalist policies have increased the birth rate in Denmark, but not to replacement level. The only developed countries, I think, with above replacement level birth rates are Faroes and Israel, as far as I'm aware. So there you go. Hungary, incidentally, said that any woman who has 2 children before the age of 30 will not have to pay tax for the rest of her life. So whether that has an impact or not, who knows? Ross?
Thanks, Convener. Just a couple of questions that haven't been covered already, although first one's on disability prevalence, so just going back to areas of discussion already. I understand entirely that the difficulty in making presumptions around changes in that going forward, but as the Convener pointed out, we've already seen a really significant increase over the last 2 decades or so, and I'm wondering to what extent you've looked into what was underlying that, i.e. have more people been disabled? So COVID would be the obvious example. Clearly, as a result of the pandemic, more people are now disabled because of long COVID. But the other story here is probably, and we've touched on it in relation to mental health, there were a lot of people who were disabled and just had not been diagnosed and it wasn't recognised, because depending on which of those it is, that has a significant economic effect, particularly on productivity. There were a lot of people in the workforce who were disabled, but it wasn't diagnosed or recognised and therefore weren't receiving support and were probably less productive than they otherwise would have been. So there's kind of 2 potentials there. If the rate continues to increase because we're diagnosing existing disabilities, we could actually increase productivity by providing people support that they need. Or if people are becoming more disabled than they were before, productivity goes in the opposite direction. Have you looked into what the underlying data suggests about the last 20 years?
Do you want to explain a bit about what we did, Claire, and I'll come back on a general comment in a second.
I mean, this is largely based on what we're seeing right now rather than historic trends in terms of how we're projecting that. Part of the trends over the last 20 years are also to do with the ageing that we've seen over the last 20 years. This is also a UK-wide phenomenon to a large extent, and the OBR have published numerous reports on this, looking at the effect of welfare reforms that the UK government has introduced to disability payments. Usually those reforms have resulted in increases in spending on disability payments, but what you just consistently see is an upward trajectory across the UK in the prevalence of disability benefits and prevalence of claims. It's a very good question what the reason is and whether it's either of those 2, and I don't think we could say with any kind of certainty.
I think it's worth saying, because it is a global, I mean, it's a widespread phenomenon. It's hard to say it's related to policies that are going on in a single country, so it sort of feels more as if there's something more underlying going on here.
And just a general comment I would make, and this comes back to the point about evidence gathering and evaluation and things, because I think you're right to question, so look, actually, if we are, for example, improving the ability to access the right payments, so people should be getting these payments, able to access them easier, etc. Can that have an impact on productivity over the long term? Well, we need to know, because that's really important, and government should really be able to evaluate that. And similarly, I would say is the child poverty stuff as well, is that, again, we know that there's at least potentially a logical argument that says if you invest in tackling child poverty, that may lead to improved economic, health outcomes, social outcomes over the long term. But it's a logical argument that I can probably say, yeah, it makes sense, but does it? What's the scale of it? And what's the relative payoff? And again, that comes back to having that evidence base to be able to, make that case is really important.
Yeah, I think particularly relevant at the moment, given UK government's announced changes, cuts to personal independence payment being framed as about getting people back into work, when that payment is not premised on people being out of work. Indeed, a lot of people who have PIP are in work already, so it can't get people into work if they're already there. And if they're not there, it's not necessarily anything related to that payment. So it does have an effect on public finance decisions as well, like around social security, like you say.
It does, yeah. And as we've spoken about recently, the first few years of social security was always about the Scottish Government essentially doing a bit more to add on to the block grant adjustments coming in from Westminster. But if the UK Government are going to actually start to seek to decrease expenditure or change, we had it with winter fuel payments, if it's going to be into things like PIP and things like that, that has a direct impact on Scotland's public finances via the fiscal framework.
Thanks. And just finally, I didn't particularly see it coming out in the report, or not as much as I might have expected to, the extent to which you've looked into the urban-rural divide here, because we've talked about depopulation. Depopulation in Scotland is sharply more of a rural issue. It's more of a West Coast issue, so it is affecting some urban West Coast communities. Inverclyde, I think, is probably the worst affected. But in general, rural depopulation much sharper than in urban areas. The provision of healthcare in health and social care in rural areas is already more expensive. Depopulation makes that harder because it's generally working age people who are leaving. It then becomes harder to provide social care packages, etc. But we're probably heading towards a tipping point where depopulation in rural areas is going to start hitting older people much more as well, because they will simply have to move to get the care that they need now. We shouldn't be getting to that. That's not a good thing. But how much does that factor into your thinking here? Because on the one hand, at the moment, it's pushing up the cost of health and social care provision in rural areas because it's working age people who are leaving. If we hit that tipping point and older people who are more in need of the services are forced to leave, that will actually, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, it's not, but that will bring down the cost of provision because people are having to move into urban areas where the provision can exist.
Yeah. So we haven't got into detail, you're right, on the urban-rural split. What we did do, we do a bit of analysis. We look at actually within health boards, where population trends might impact upon health boards and where the effects might be. Part of that, again, is because we look at the national picture, we don't delve into the detail about that. But again, I think, I don't disagree with the types of things you're saying could be potentially important, because you're right, you might be making some savings in some areas because of lower population, but it's not like for like, because you don't get the economies of scale. Similar with education as well. So again, delivery of rural schools, a small decline in the population, if you still want to keep the school open, that has a potential impact in there. And we haven't really delved into that. I mean, one area where I think, just broadening that out, where I think is quite interesting, and again, we highlight it in the report, but we don't go into detail, is the whole social care element. So we focused on health, but I think what's really interesting, I think, is thinking about some of exactly these sorts of issues about social care. I mean, we assume, for example, that policy stays the same as it is at the moment, but that implicitly assumes that as you're an ageing population, you still have the same proportion of people doing informal care or care outside the system. That's quite a big assumption that we make. And again, we do it just for transparency and we're focusing on health, but that's something that, well, what would happen if that started to change? What would happen if there wasn't that kind of latent labour market that could support that sort of care, particularly in rural areas? That would potentially be another fiscal risk that we'd have to explore. So again, that might be something, if there was interest, is the sort of thing when we're thinking about what we do next, could be an area we explore.
Thanks, Roch. And that's all from me, Convener.
Thanks very much. A good point. Roch made 37% of universal credit recipients are already in work. So I think that's something that's perhaps not been talked about as much as it should be. I mean, one of the things that was mentioned earlier on by Professor Breeden was about, and yourself, Professor Roy, was about how important debt is, and whether the 98% the UK pays could possibly go to 150%. But if you actually think about the impact on debt interest, the UK already pays 6 times more in debt interest than it spends on the NHS in Scotland in a year. So obviously, if the debt goes up, the interest payments go up, and likely that the level of interest will have to go up because the rating will decline. So I think that's quite important. But I just wanted to ask one final question. It was about climate change, actually, which Michelle touched on. I mean, I'll just read out this quote for the record. It says, "The report doesn't integrate the effects of climate change or the Scottish Government's climate change response into our projections because the data is currently unavailable. Climate change has been deemed the most important health threat of the century." And you talk about, the impact on society and individuals of wetter winters, hotter dry summers, temperature extremes, frequent flooding, etc., health and well-being. So I'm just wondering what discussions you've had with the Scottish Government, and indeed through perhaps the OBR, the UK Government, in terms of trying to secure that data, because the presentation that you had last year when you said it would take like £186 billion, public and private combined at last year's prices to reach, to deal with the climate crisis, is a figure that kind of really sticks in my mind. So I'm just wondering where you are with all that.
Yeah. There's a couple of things. So one is I guess the data ask we've had about climate change and the specific information that we need from the government about its climate change plans and what's in the budget, etc. And I understand that's still pretty much ongoing. We've had our data request into the government, and I guess when we review our data request, we'll see how much evidence is being provided in that. But it's not, I think, at the detailed level that we would need in terms of how net zero is being achieved, etc. I think the other bit that we've highlighted is the whole adaptation piece and the risk piece, and that's the bit which, again, to be fair to government, is a much broader question about the collecting the data and understanding this in quite a different way, and that is another area which needs to be improved. So some of it's about our existing data ask, and some of it is about understanding the real detail about where climate risks would impact on health, and that's where the evidence base is slightly less clear, and that's not a Scottish thing; it's a wider issue.
And yet there seems to be less focus on this issue than there's been in recent years. So I just want to ask you, just as we wind up, if there's any further issue you wish to touch on that perhaps we haven't covered that you want to emphasise?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I hope that I know the committee has pushed us quite hard on delivering these fiscal sustainability reports, and you wanted an update on demographics, and I think that's been quite helpful in many ways, and I hope that this report, helps move it on a bit. I think we'll then be in touch with the committee, I think, and thinking about what we do next, and again, that will be quite important, I think, not just for next year, but into the future, what more we can do to help add a bit more information and clarity around this.
Well, we have a commitment now from the Scottish Government to have an annual fiscal sustainability debate, and I'm sure this report will make a significant contribution to our deliberations on that. So I just want to thank you for your evidence this morning. You certainly came mob-handed. So we'll just wind up the session with just a wee advert for tomorrow. There's a session tomorrow on this specific report, actually, organised by SPICE at 8:30 in the Holyrood Room. You're all welcome. Apparently there's a young, dynamic and outrageously handsome MSP in the chair, so that alone will be worth attending for. There's also going to be baking rolls, which I know are always a big draw, and I realise it's one or two colleagues have got committees at tomorrow, so won't be able to come along, Liz, for example, but I hope those who can certainly will. I think it will be an opportunity to ask further questions of this really important report. So thank you once again, and we'll just call a 2-minute break to allow broadcasting and the official report to leave. Thank you. The next item on our agenda, and I do apologise for suggesting we had a private session when we don't, is an evidence session with the Minister for Public Finance on the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, Group Relief and Subsale Development Relief Modification Scotland Order 2025. The Minister is joined today by Scottish Government official Laura Parker, LBTT Policy Lead, Directorate for Tax and Revenues. I welcome our witnesses to the meeting and I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement. Ivan.
Good afternoon, Convener and Committee. The Land and Buildings Transactions Tax, Group Relief and Subsale Development Relief Modification Scotland Order 2025 provides for amendments to Schedule 10 and 10A of the Land and Buildings Transactions Tax Scotland Act 2013. Schedule 10 is amended to ensure that group relief is available in instances of non-partition demergers. The effect is that group relief will be available in company reconstructions where ultimate ownership of relevant land or property has not changed. Schedule 10A is amended to clarify the point at which the relevant 5-year development period commences in respect of subsale development relief. This is important as relief may be withdrawn where significant development does not take place within this period. The amendment provides clarity for relevant stakeholders, making clear that the relevant period commences from the effective date of the subsale transaction. The Scottish Fiscal Commission considered the financial impact of these amendments in their December 2024 forecasts and deemed the amendments to have an immaterial and negligible impact, respectively. The order was developed following engagement with stakeholders as part of the Aggregates Tax and Devolved Taxes Administration Scotland Bill process. Members will recall that these amendments were considered by this committee at Stage 2 of the bill process. While the amendments were deemed out of scope at Stage 3, the Scottish Government nevertheless recognises the need for these changes to be made. I welcome the contributions from stakeholders in developing the contents of the draft order and I look forward to taking questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that statement. I don't have any questions myself, so I'm going to open out to members of the committee. And the first person to ask questions, indeed the only one I have at the moment, is Ross.
Thanks, Convener, and good afternoon, Minister. Not a question about this specific as such, but more about the wider approach to dealing with anomalies in ADS and LBTT. Is this not just a bit fragmented, the way we've been going about this? I recognise what you're saying of issues of amendments being out of scope for bills and things, but we had the ADS review work where your predecessor, Tom Arthur, dealing with some anomalies. There's wider LBTT review work underway, but it feels like we're dealing with this in a very piecemeal way rather than having recognised a few years ago that there was a variety of anomalies that everybody agrees need to be resolved, taking a more holistic approach to addressing all of them across both LBTT and ADS?
Well, I think over the period of time that those measures have been in place, ADS, there's been a number of issues that were risen that were not foreseen at the time we brought the legislation in, so there were changes that had to be made because of specific complicated circumstances that occurred where there was necessary for some clarity or changes in the provisions, and likewise with these specific measures. I think we actually haven't had any examples where people have come forward and this has been a problem in terms of the transactions they are seeking to take forward or have taken forward, but there has been a call for stakeholders that would clarify just to be absolutely sure that investors and others are very clear about what the law is in this regard. So it's very much a tidying up exercise. I think this obviously happens with all legislation. I don't know if we would have had a different approach to it, and clearly if other examples arise where stakeholders feel, as with any legislation, there's a need for clarification or to tidy up some technical points, then we would seek to respond to that.
I mean, I accept all that. I suppose part of this comes from a frustration that some of the issues, more so about ADS to be fair than LBTT, but issues related to that around catching people who were in the process of family separation, divorce. We've talked, I've written to you and we've talked before about disabled people, someone else purchasing a home on their behalf, that kind of thing. These issues have been around for a while. The review was a good few years ago now, 4 years ago maybe, something like that. It still just feels like we're dealing with some of this in a very fragmented manner rather than taking a holistic approach, saying, right, here are all of the anomalies across the system. We collectively agree nobody ever intended for these to be the case. This is how we're going to address them. Because I've certainly had correspondence from people who've been caught by various anomalies over time who just find it very hard to get an understanding of the government's approach to dealing with this. Certainly people who felt that the anomaly that they were caught by was something the government had indicated a few years ago it was going to address, but that's still not happened yet, and that they find it hard. I find it hard to get an understanding, even of a timeline from the government about how it's addressing all of these.
And this is in regard to outstanding issues that haven't been resolved as of yet?
Yeah, some of them.
Some, right, okay. Yeah. Well, I'm very happy for you to write to me and we'll respond on those specifically with regards to timeline for resolution, but clearly the review that's coming forward on LBTT will catch or is intended to sweep up those and other issues. But understand the point you're making, and we'll commit to give more certainty on timescales around about resolution of these issues.
Thank you. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. We have no further questions from members of the committee. So we turn to agenda item 4, which involves formal consideration of the motion on the instrument. I invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S6M 16929 that the Finance and Public Administration Committee recommends that the Land and Building and Transaction Tax Group Relief and Subsale Development Relief Modifications to Scotland Order 2025 draft be approved.
Moved.
Moved. Do you wish to speak to the motion at all?
No.
Okay, thank you. Do any members wish to speak? No indication. I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S6M 16929 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I'd like to thank the Minister and Ms Parker for their evidence today. We will publish a short report to Parliament setting out a decision on the instrument as that was the last item on the public agenda, I now close this public session and we will move into private session.